The story began on a fateful day during a job interview, when Duck was facing a recruiting panel of 3. One of the men asked Duck how he planned to purify water, but the doofus said he'd just spray his jizz into the ocean. His response disgusted them, so they asked him his motive for applying to their company, because his resume was nothing more than the documented evidence of his stupidity. The man said he should feel ashamed and embarrassed because it was pointless for a talentless societal reject like himself to apply to a prestigious company like theirs, but this just pissed Duck off. Ever since dungeons were discovered in this world, hidden abilities within people were revealed as talents, which enabled the development of civilization. This was initially seen as a blessing, but Duck could beg to differ because he had 0 talent, 0 riz, and 0 body count. The recruiters went on to add that their company had no use for him, but Duck told them that they were being discriminative against talentless people, and that wasn't allowed in their country. This annoyed the recruiters, and they said they were fed up with all those seeking justice for losers, just like Duck. With a straight, unperturbed expression, Duck asked them to apologize, but the men said they deserved an apology for surviving a conversation with someone who only had 2 brain cells. The next thing Duck did was get up and say that since they'd refused to apologize to him, he'd recorded their entire conversation, which portrayed just how discriminatory the company was towards people with no talent. Immediately, the recruiters were humbled and said they were only trying to crack dad jokes, but Duck told them to save their silly excuses for the Human Rights Committee. As he stopped out of the building, Duck was certainly feeling himself because he just sent the report to the Human Rights Committee, but he accidentally stepped on someone's disgusting bubble gum, and as he tried getting rid of it, he was unintentionally sprayed with irrigation water. It was safe to say that Duck had the worst luck on that day, so he was just glad to return home in peace. However, he found out that some of the neighbors graffitied his walls with their diarrhea, so he grudgingly cleaned it up. He got on the phone with his mom, who was on admission in the hospital, and she apologized for causing him so much stress. Duck didn't think she was any form of stress, but the moment she said they could just avert all the trouble by paying the money his daft uncle borrowed, Duck was upset and reminded her that his uncle in question had the intention of paying his debts and had probably run off with a thought. He immediately apologized for raising his voice and assured her that he'd take care of her hospital bills while she recovered. Afterwards, Duck went upstairs and proceeded to light a cigarette, but it suddenly started raining and Duck was pissed as heck, so he flung his lighter out of annoyance. He rhetorically yelled at the skies, saying he'd worked his buns off for nothing, so he at least deserved to get a smoke in peace. He also asked the gods why they kept getting in his way and angrily slammed his fist on the floor while crying profusely as he was frustrated beyond words. Suddenly, almost like God was responding to his tantrums, lightning struck from the skies and Duck gave the heavens his ugly middle finger. But then he was struck down by lightning and slowly crashed to the ground, as he accepted that he was about to die a useless death after living a worthless life. Eventually, Duck lay lifeless on the ground and died with so many unanswered questions, but the next thing he knew, his eyes were opened again and it seemed like he didn't die after all. However, he saw a notification in the skies, showing a hiring notice with an added note that the gods were waiting for him. After his ordeal, Duck was left wondering if there was really a god because he'd been struck by lightning as soon as he swore and cursed at God. This may have been some judgment of the sort, but when most people were hit by lightning, they mostly just died. However, Duck had survived the ordeal without as much as a scratch, and the issue right now was how to get rid of the hiring message that was floating above his head. He began to reason that it was some sort of status window people with talent could see, and it suddenly occurred to him that the lightning that struck him may have blessed him with a talent, so the only issue now was to test his theory. However, he reanalyzed that the floating message may not be a status window, and it looked more like a part-time job notification. However, something strange occurred that instant. More windows appeared and some weird connection was started, which eventually granted him access to the system. Duck was startled, but eventually he confirmed that it was a part-time job notice, and he laughed heartily, because even in real life, he was only good enough for part-time jobs, and right now the same thing was happening. However, he decided to think more positively because he had nothing to lose anyway, and half an opportunity was better than being a broke mama's boy living rent-free with his mom. Taking a look at God's part-time offer, he noticed that there were categories of jobs, and he clicked on one, only to be told that he lacked divine power. He was getting confused about that too, when the system notified him that divine power was the unit of energy used by the gods. Of course, Duck won't have possessed that because he lacked basic talent, but this felt like a safe situation for him and could be the turning point for him in life. Eventually, he decided to go for it and explored the part-time jobs app. So he found a couple jobs that required no divine power. He eventually found a job offer from Thor, who was seeking manpower to create a dungeon and permitted even the lowest god classes. However, Duck was skeptical about this job because dungeons had tons of monsters, but he also shockingly discovered that those dungeons were made by the gods. For now, he needed to see how much he'd be earning, but he only saw that he'd be paid 12 Thor, so he wondered if this currency of the gods could be exchanged for a different currency. With the assumption that the money being used by the gods would be worth a lot, Duck finally accepted the job, and a bright light shone from the skies and teleported Duck to a strange forest. He was just as confused about where the gods had teleported him, and felt this was a result of gooning too much and having nasty dreams. But even before he could go explore the place, a monster leaped from behind him and almost had Duck's head for lunch. But a giant hand appeared from nowhere and rescued Duck's empty brain, a hand belonging to none other than the cheapest version of Thor on the market. He shot Duck a bombastic side eye and recognized him as a new worker, after which he introduced himself as the god of thunder and son of Odin. Anyway, he felt there was no point in introducing himself when the fat hammer between his legs could do all the talking. As he picked Duck up like a weightless dog, Duck couldn't help but admire this giant god who was built like a rock and had more hairs on his mustache than you'll ever have on your head. This felt too good to be true, but Thor even surprised Duck more when Thor referred to him as a god from Asia and showed him some other gods on the side. Duck suddenly felt like the only human in that place, so he didn't deny being a god and said he came from a small mountain. Erroneously, Thor assumed him to be the god of mountains who was famous for helping humans in danger, so he applauded Duck for that, but he noted that Duck was deeply immersed in human culture. Nervously, Duck said he only went down to learn a lot about humans, so Thor asked if he still wanted to take the job because it entailed creating a place that'd make humans suffer. Surely, that was weird and giving Jack the Ripper energy, but Duck had to play it cool and said he definitely could do the job. As they ascended the staircase, Thor asked him if he'd heard of the Minotaurus' maze, and Duck said he had, but he didn't understand why the question. Right then, Thor pointed to the brightest thing he'd seen in a while and referred to the maze as the concept for building the new dungeon, meaning that Duck would be joining them to build a maze. A few moments into the task, Duck was worked to the bone, but there was even more work to do. He crawled out of a manhole to where the other laborers were, and there was an announcement made for his sector, which he responded to between bites. However, the guy announced for him again, and he was only one deep breath away from shredding the idiot's head. The man encouraged him to keep working hard, but to watch out for manholes, but Duck wouldn't mind getting stuck in a man's hole. Later, he worked some more and was about done for the day, so his commander asked how work went and Duck pretended it was really easy, even though his shoulders were about to give up on him. The leader asked Jim to proceed to the carriage and rest for a while, because they'd use it to transport themselves to the next place. Later on in the carriage, the commander asked if other Asian gods were as enthusiastic as Duck, so Duck said it would mostly depend on their personalities. However, the man told him that compliments were already flying around about Duck, and the boy was shy, even though in his head he was really proud of himself and glad to be chilling with those ugly gods instead of having any dumb talent. Soon, they got off the carriage because the taskmaster said they'd be heading to the next place by themselves, since he didn't want to let the giant fluff-brained Teddy destroy the meaningful traps they're setting. Right then, he cautioned Duck, who was about to step on a trap, and then alerted him about certain signs on the floor to look out against, as well as many others. He continued to discuss with Duck, saying that upper-class senior gods required some tests from humans, while low-class gods couldn't afford to do such things, so they were stuck with building for a living. And even worse, the dungeons had to be built constantly, so they were always going to have an infinite amount of workload. Duck was shocked to hear that he'd be a sweaty builder for years, but the task manager distracted him by saying they should go check out a room that must have been built up already. Duck was surprised to find that the huge stone chamber, which should have taken longer to build, was already built in just a few minutes. The chambers were wider than an old lady's black hole, so Duck was curious about how they made it so wide. Eventually, the task guy asked Duck to drop the box he was holding and said it contained items that'd make the dungeons worthy of serving as tests by the gods. Duck looked inside to find a round-shaped rock, which the taskmaster explained to be something from which spiders could spawn out of. There were tons of such stones, so the dungeon was sure as heck to be a pain for humans to explore. Duck's eyes were attracted to some monster, so he asked about it and was told that it was a lizard man. On its neck, Duck was about to touch some transparent part of the lizard, but the other guy told him to hands off because that was the lizard man's vital spot, and it hadn't completed its embodiment. They went into the next room and Duck was shown the goblin hiding shelter, and added that humans who'd gotten to that point were certainly close to the final destination. The place felt really cold and chilly, and suddenly, Duck spotted a dark figure in the shadow, which he later discovered to be a goblin. Without hesitating, the Rastafarian goblin plunged itself toward the terrified Duck, but soon burst out laughing mischievously as Duck was pissing his pants. The taskmaster told him to chill because the goblin was only messing with him, but said it'd be a completely different story when the dungeon was completed because those monsters were extra smart and clever, hence difficult to confront. Eventually, they arrived at the end of the labyrinth with a giant beast head at the large gate, where the boss monster lay. Just then, Thor showed up and said hi to Duck, saying he'd heard so many great compliments about him. He asked him how work was going and Duck said it was all good, while appreciating Thor for the opportunity to work for him. Thor hailed him for speaking like a true gentleman and asked about the progress of their work, so the task manager said they were down to the final procedure. This excited Thor, but he unexpectedly brought out his hammer to send them off, while bidding Duck goodbye. Duck, who didn't know what was going on, soon found himself right back at home and was glad that he wasn't getting squashed to death for lying to Thor about being a god. He found it hard to believe that everything was real and not a daydream, and he was glad that he'd finally awaken. Just then, the status window appeared, notifying Duck that his salary had been paid. He swallowed hard and was rather nervous even as he agreed to check how much salary he had earned, but what he saw shocked him beyond his imagination. Instead of some real cash, the system showed him that he'd earned Odin's spear that never missed a target, a lion armor that could neutralize all physical damage, and Freya's necklace, which could facilitate interdimensional travel. Seeing this, Duck realized that it was some sort of eBay for the gods, so he saw some powers such as Thor's power, lighting, Hephaestus's power, flame, and Ares' power, destruction. This made Duck curious, and he wondered whether he could purchase those powers and possibly transform from a human to a god. Dude was daydreaming about a reality that was far from him, but he turned on a switch as he prepared to change his life forever. However, the system flat out told him he was too broke to afford his daydreams because Thor's power was the cheapest, and even that was about 70,000 Thors. He wondered what else he could afford with his money and found talents in the store, so he became excited after seeing that all he needed to do was buy the talents he was doomed never to have. However, one SS-class talent cost 12 Thor, and Duck found this to be really cheap thanks to the fact that gods hardly purchased such garbage. But seeing that this was even an SS-class talent, he was even more impressed. He chose the talent of the sword and reminisced on the past, when he played with some dumb toy swords, so he was pretty sure there was no point in hesitating to buy the sword. He eventually purchased it, and there was this glowing magical phenomenon around him that surrounded him, and made him if he now possessed the talent of swordsmanship. In the past, Duck would do everything just to get an F-class talent, so he couldn't believe he got it so easily now. The system congratulated him for purchasing his first item and rewarded him by giving him a gift with the same class as the item he purchased. Duck had some dumb crocodile tears in his eyes as he realized he was going to get one more SS-class talent, so he chose the talent of combat and began celebrating that he'd be using both skills. But suddenly something strange happened and everything became blurry, while Duck found himself lying on the floor and unable to move as his insured body hurt. His system was strengthening his body to adjust to his talent, so it began by increasing his lung capacity and increasing his muscle strength. Eventually, his body was successfully strengthened, but Duck had long gone into dreamland and his mother visited him in his sleep, apologizing for being an incompetent mom and making him suffer. Duck told his mom that he now had a talent, but she said that there was no way under if he was going to have something like that. Eventually, he woke up and found himself on the floor, but was surprised and dismayed that everything he thought was real was a dream. He called upon the status window and saw that he was a god of the lowest class, and that indeed, he possessed the talent of swordsmanship and combat. The fact that he was even a god was shocking, but that explained why he was able to work in the dungeon, but he accepted this unfairness in life as normal. Later, a call came in from his mom, and he eagerly told her he had good news. However, she told him not to visit the hospital on that day, and even when Duck prodded her to reveal the reason, she only told him to do his best and stay away from the hospital. When he didn't stop asking questions, one of the hospital staff said there were signs of a dungeon near their hospital, and they wouldn't be permitting visitors into the hospital anymore. This threw Duck in a frenzy, and he ran to rescue his mum, even as he ran out of breath. Meanwhile, a helicopter was in the sky. Thunder was rumbling, and the whole city was in chaos as a reporter shed insight on the signs of the dungeon appearing all around. One of the soldiers tried to get everyone away from the danger zone, which was restricted, and Duck had just arrived in a taxi watching everything happening from a distance and wondering what the heck was happening. He activated his combat focus skill and zoomed toward the soldier who was calling on his only fans. From behind, he overheard some people saying that the government was gathering all the hunters in the country, and the guys were worried because this time around the dungeon situation was rather dangerous. It seemed Duck's skill was enabling him to hear every single whisper around him, and it was driving him crazy as he wondered if he had messed up by buying those talents earlier. Anyway, there was no time to think because he had to rush to the hospital. He eventually got across to the soldier and said he had family in the hospital, but the man said there were signs of a maze in the dungeon, so they couldn't permit him to get in. Duck thought for a second when he looked up at the sky and saw lightning, after which a bright light shone through. The chaotic situation reached its peak, and so many people were dispersed as they tried to avoid the disaster unfolding. Even Duck barely escaped a small accident right beside him, and this threw him into further confusion about what on earth was happening. It was right then that he saw exactly what dropped from the sky. It was the exact maze he was working on for Thor and the dungeon he had helped build. Duck was confused and wondered why the dungeon was there, but he saw an older man scrunched over, so he helped pick him up. As they tried moving to safety, Duck was suddenly separated from the man by a very strong force after he noticed that it was a sword that had flown right through them and landed on someone. When he looked up, he saw some half-dead dude who used his last breath to tell him to run away. Right behind him was a lizard man with precious eyes, who put the man to his death. He thereafter called upon lizard men who came, and a soldier on the opposite side commanded the others to open fire, because the lizard man had appeared on the front lines. No matter how hard they tried to shoot at those lizard men, it seemed the beasts were just invincible. While real men were fighting, this weak disappointment of an mech was scrunched up in the corner and telling them to consider that he was somewhere in the picture. He drew the wrong man's attention, and one of the lizard men spotted him and immediately charged ferociously towards him to attack. As a counterattack, Duck's combat focus skill was activated, and some energy from his eyes diverted towards the lizard man and enveloped his sword. At the same time, Duck's eyes suddenly became fixed on the sword, so he braced himself up. Just when the sword came an inch close to his face, he stopped right in with his hand. He was so shocked at what had just happened, because that was the first time in his life he had ever made the Brotherhood proud. Almost immediately, he sensed another attack head straight for the injured man beside him, and immediately cautioned him to watch out. Unfortunately, the man was moving slower than that thing you call a brain, and a soldier had just fired a bullet at a lizard man, so Duck had to step in right then and took the lizard man out of the scene. The soldier's commander ordered them to seize because there was a citizen right in front of them, although they wondered if Duck was one of the hunters and how he had the balls to show up without weapons. Meanwhile, he was surrounded by all the lizard men, and the post-nut clarity hit him as he realized that these dudes were about to stick their long shafts in his second hole. One of the angry lizard man was about to slice him with the sword, and all this ugly fool could think of saying was that he was sorry. But the system helped him by activating the combat focus, so again, it seemed like everyone's actions were playing in slow-mo before his very eyes, and he could see their precise movements. When he realized the abilities granted to him by his skill, Duck eventually activated the talent of combat and delivered some feisty fire attacks at the lizard man. He watched this in shock as he couldn't believe that his attack was working, but now he had the confidence to take on the remaining two. They charged and swung at him, but he dodged and delivered some pretty impressive punches at the jaw of one of the lizard men. Finally, he was left facing one lizard man with some village head type of haircut who was running straight towards him. But to his utmost surprise, Duck disappeared into the sky, dodging his attack, and landed right on him with the most powerful kick ever that dismantled his ugly jaw. The soldiers watching this had a wargasm just by seeing how big Duck's cannonballs were, and were even more impressed to see that he had defeated the lizard man with his bare hands. The other hand, some gray-haired freak, asked him which guild he was from, and was accompanied by other adventurers. Even though he recognized that Duck's hideous face was pretty rare, he just had to commend him for his fighting skills. The man introduced himself as Namgong, the guild master of the Sangoon Guild, and he extended his hand for a handshake with Duck, as he smartly guessed that Duck was an unaffiliated hunter working with no guild. When Duck confirmed this, Namgung said he'd come with his party members to clear the new dungeon and was hence inviting Duck to join them. For a second, Duck hesitated, but looking at the dungeon gave him PTSD as he remembered the things Thor's hammer did to all his openings. And since there'd be an endless stream of monsters into the city, he decided to join them and venture into the dungeon. When they had walked to a certain point, Duck directed them to a path. But Namgung wasn't too thrilled about this and exchanged a knowing, sinister look with one of his thugs. Meanwhile, the innocent Duck was just glad that he had memorized the dungeon, thanks to his endless hours of work there. Ignoring his guidance, the guild leader walked past him and got Duck confused, so he insisted that he would lead them through the dungeon from that point to the very end. This angered one of the guys, and he asked Duck when he developed the guts to act out on his own, because they had an order of hierarchy in their guild. However, Duck explained that from that point onward, there were pits and traps awaiting them, hence why he was trying to lead them. But then Namgung simply thanked him for worrying and said he was sure the advance party had already paved the way. Duck didn't waste any more of his saliva and instead threw a piece of rock into the darkness. To their greatest shock, the stone was sliced into many bits and pieces, so it was obvious the advance party didn't survive thus far. He later demonstrated that the trap was activated by decompression and the spears were created from special grade alloy, which permitted them to pierce through anything even though they looked simple. This much information made Namgung ask how Duck knew so much, so the idiot took a second to prepare his response since he couldn't confess to helping build the dungeon. He decided to leave it as a business secret and led them on, but the expression on his face changed to a more serious one, and he warned them that things were about to get raw and dirty. The men were getting excited because they thought they'd get some, until they arrived at a giant gate with a spider inscription on it. In only a matter of minutes, the group was dealing with some medium-sized spiders which were really frustrating and made them wonder whether they'd survive or not. Apparently, the spiderwebs all over served as the network of the spiders as well as a trap, so it would be a lot easier if they just burnt them. These instructions were given by Duck, and the guys were really skeptical about trusting his words because could be a spy from another guild, trying to slow down their own attacks. In his own thoughts, Duck remembered that it was in that particular room that he had placed countless boxes with spider eggs, so he knew exactly where the spiders were hiding. But there was no point in doing all of that because he'd just burned them all to a crisp. Together with the other guys, they torched the webs of the spiders, and Duck's focus skill was activated again, leading his attention to a frail cry. Apparently someone had been trapped in the webs and seeking help, so he had to stop the party members from burning down the place because somebody was in there. Namgung ordered his men to hold off because there were people trapped in the chambers, and so they should prioritize saving the survivors to form a defensive structure, because they didn't know what exact situation the survivors were in, and they also had to keep their eyes peeled for Duck, who'd be commanding the support team. On his own, Duck wasn't particularly excited about commanding anyone because he knew he didn't even have the discipline to command his own self. He was about to decline this position when one of the members walked up to him and thanked him for helping them to cross the traps unscathed while begging him to lead them again. He agreed and shook hands with her, quite hesitantly, but she told him not to worry too much and just command them by informing them and the location of the survivors, after which the support team would handle the rest. As long as it'd be simple, Duck was game, but he first had to tell the lady to let go of his hands before he'd pin her to the floor and ravage her meat. She curiously asked whether he used weapons, but Duck said he had never used one before, so she advised him to have at least a sword for self-defense. Thereafter she bade him goodbye and took off, leaving Duck very confused as he wondered why she had so much guts. She'd soon disappeared and everyone got into positions as they prepared to enter the next room. When they got in, they noticed that the room was too quiet, but Namgung told them to remain focused and not lose guard. Suddenly Duck yelled out that something was right above them, and they looked up to see almost giant spiders they'd seen thus far. Without warning, the giant spiders began to attack, and one of the adventurers stood like a log of wood waiting for his third leg to get him back to his senses, so Namgung stepped in quickly and defended him against the beasts while reminding him that he had to stick to the plan. Duck, on the other hand, told them to get into a defensive structure and watch out for the paralyzing venom of the spiders. Suddenly his focus eye was activated, and a few meters from him, he spotted some people who were trapped in the spiderwebs. He motioned to the other members saying he had found the other survivors, so they went over and cut them free from the silk threads binding them and led the way to a safe place. In the middle of his own battle, Namgung was impressed because he initially doubted Duck, so he was now motivated to get rid of those spiders. knowing that Duck actually knew his way around the dungeon, including the location of the survivors. The guys got busier and kept recovering more and more survivors up until the moment when all the survivors were rescued. After this was reported to Namgung, he told them to rest up and told Duck that he would like to have a word. Some of the party members were giving him a snide look that made him feel like it was all over for him, but their leader really just wanted to tell him just how many people he had saved, including a member of their advanced party, and who would have been burned if it were not for Duck's timely wisdom and intervention. He was quite impressed and said Duck's talent felt like he had even constructed the dungeon by himself. But the idiot simply laughed it off and tried hard to change his perspective. Later they arrived at another gate that had a symbol from the goblin civilization. But the adventurers felt it was a bit disappointing because they didn't expect to go from deadly spiders to cheap dirt goblins. But Duck was a bit worried because he didn't have a foolproof plan as they were approaching the goblin ambush area. However, he hoped that his combat-focused skill would make it possible, so he asked if he could just go in by himself. But one of the guild members told him he was getting full of himself, and it was just a bunch of goblins anyway, so he could sit that one out and watch them defeat them like mosquitoes. Also, Namgung expressed that he wouldn't feel comfortable sending Duck all by himself even though it seemed he had a plan. The boy eventually agreed and said they had to listen to his orders when they were inside. However, one of the jealous guild members was angry because he wanted to seize this opportunity to gain his master's approval and feed on his fat sausage. So he'd now have to deal with Duck because he couldn't let him steal the spotlight. They charged in through the gate and found nothing but a large empty hallway. But Duck told him to shut the heck up because he could send something inside. This other dude burst out laughing with his companions, saying there was obviously nothing there except probably some dead cockroach. And even if Duck was scared of some goblins, they would protect him either way. Suddenly, the hall went dark, and the adventurers planned to turn on their flashlight, but Duck warned them against that. They thought it was just bullcrap because there was no way they could fight without seeing, and it was so surprising that Duck, who called himself a hunter, was terrified of goblins. So they advised him to sit back and watch like the scaredy cat he was, but he immediately ordered them to get down immediately. Namgung and the other guy couldn't see why they should duck, so they turned on a light and found out that there wasn't anything. However, Namgung's subordinate suddenly stopped moving, and he turned around to reveal multiple arrows shot at his chest. Before they knew it, he was attacked multiple times and fell flat on his stomach in a bloodbath of his own blood. Namgung was horrified by this, and another of his subordinates was also shot down, so he was confused about the origin of the attacks, and while they were all in the frenzy, he immediately commanded that no one else should move an inch. He then asked Duck if that was the reason why he told them not to turn their flashlights, and Duck affirmed it, saying that when the goblins saw any form of light attack in that direction. Namgung was now more confused that the goblins hadn't attacked even though they were hearing, so Duck explained that the filthy creatures were mostly playing with their prey since they enjoyed the sight of humans getting terrified in the darkness. Yet, Namgung highlighted that they wouldn't be able to attack without their flashlights, and so they'd have to accept some casualties. On the contrary, Duck suggested that they fight without seeing, and when Namgung looked at him like he'd smoked something even Wiz Khalifa wouldn't smoke, all Duck could do was encourage the old man to let him handle emerging from there onwards. He stepped forth and told the other guild members that he knew they were scared to the bones and pissing their pants, but he'd do anything in his power to rescue everyone, and they didn't have to make a sound or move until he commanded them to. After this, he activated his focus skill, which made him sense that he himself was surrounded by some goblins. He took care of matters in the dark while the guys were completely unaware of what was happening, but soon he commanded them to turn their lights on and move. There was a surprising turn-up of dead goblins, which was all thanks to Duck's unbelievable strength, and he squeezed the breath out of the last goblin to everyone's shock. The hater in their midst was upset that, yet again, Duck had beaten him to it and seized his opportunity to impress the boss. As usual, Namgung was impressed with Duck's performance, but the guy knew it was all thanks to luck and some powerful ancient voodoo. They proceeded deeper into the labyrinth and arrived at the next gate, which was the final gate of the maze, where the boss lay in wait. After taking a deep breath, Namgung led the way in but was surprised to find out there was nothing in sight, and he was scared that the boss could be hiding somewhere. However, Duck told him that the boss was right in their presence. Another small gate gradually opened up and revealed the dungeon boss sitting on his throne. This guy was whom Duck referred to as the owner of the dungeon, so Namgung and the beast exchanged a deadly stare to assert which of them was boss. Namgung established that the boss wouldn't attack them first, so they had time to plan their moves. Right then, a status window appeared in front of Duck with an event called the Human Sacrifice of the Minotaur, so he could select 5 sacrificial candidates. This was entirely new to Duck, and he also realized that he was the only one who could see the message, so he felt someone was playing games with him, and it would be in his best interest to share this information. He walked up to Namgung to share an idea, but the leader said they were discussing a plan, and whatever he had to say could wait until after that. However, when he said that the information could help them conquer the dungeon, the man's eyes were suddenly lit with interest, and they both discussed their plan in secret. This was 10 times more frustrating for Duck's hater, because, yet again, Duck was stealing all his credits, so he decided not to let this happen once more under his watch. He went off on his own and found a proper angle from where he could attack the boss, because strategies were only for losers and scaredy cats begging for defeat. He possessed a talent known as the talent of aim, so all he needed to do was land a single shot and gain the recognition he felt he deserved. However, he realized that he needed to draw closer to get the bullseye shot he needed, so he took one more step. At that instant, Duck spotted him and immediately warned him to back off. But the insolent fool retorted that Duck was only stopping him so he could take the credit all for himself. But it was not going to work this time around, as the boss beast was his to defeat. The idiot proceeded to attack, but soon triggered a warning that he had trespassed into the boss room of the labyrinth, and as such, random scapegoats would be selected. Suddenly, some weird form of rain began to pour, along with some magical items, so Duck, Namgung, and one other guy were enshrouded in a blue aura, including the jealous fool who had triggered the reaction. He tried to explain his stupidity to his boss, but Namgung was upset with this fool because he had no idea precisely how terrible his mistake was. It seemed the 5 of them were selected as human sacrifices, so they were all summoned before the boss. It glared at them and roared ferociously, but the very first fool to fall on his saggy expired buns was the dumb dude who had trespassed the area. He was soon surrounded by a magical barrier and desperately cried out for help as he was repeatedly banged against it, but nothing and no one could save him. Alone with the boss, he was about to explain his stupidity to the ancestors, but Namgung quickly stepped in and swooped him before the boss could squash him completely. He then ordered his subordinates to remain calm and widen the formation that they'd earlier discussed, while he focused on distracting the boss beast. As the monster moved to attack Namgung, he dashed forward his axe and lifted off the ground, preparing to land a blow directly on the beast. The attack landed successfully, and the subordinates were glad and very proud of the captain, including Duck, who saw that the guild master was operating on a different level. Unfortunately, he saw that the axe barely scratched the surface of the beast's skin. Even Namgung felt like he hit steel armor, and not some leather skin, so he was dismayed. But tragedy almost struck when the Duck suddenly warned him to watch out, and Namgung barely dodged a mighty swing from the beast's axe. He, unfortunately, sustained a bleeding wound on his right upper arm, which made him realize that any careless attack from this fearsome monster could end him on the spot. Immediately, he commanded his men to deploy an enclosing formation. They gathered around, and he told them to gather information about the beast's weaknesses. Watching him, Duck appreciated Namgung's flawless leadership, but noticed that nothing seemed to be working against the beast. To make matters worse, the monster began to emanate lightning from its body, and Duck noticed that it was getting overpowered by Thor. At the same time, Namgung noticed that the monster was up to something sinister, so he commanded his subordinates to disrupt its plans, and the moment there was an opening, he moved speedily to launch his attack. Unfortunately, Duck's warning came in too late, and even Namgung realized that he moved at the wrong time, so he soon was surrounded by lightning. However, Duck stepped in to create a distraction, but the monster only shot him a warning look and still went on to launch a powerful attack. At this point, Duck realized that it was already too late, and right before him, a bright, electrifying explosion occurred, which knocked them all out, including Namgung. As he watched from the barrier behind, the foolish adventurer couldn't believe his eyes, and the surviving members tried to figure out how to get back up. Duck was lying passed out on the floor and couldn't believe that after having such a difficult life, it was all about the end just like that, even after he was blessed with a talent. However, it seemed he hadn't given up yet and tried to pull himself up because there was one more thing that he hadn't tried. This approach was dangerous as heck, but Duck was ready to risk it all because he didn't come this far just to end up like that. He picked up his sword and stared at the monster squarely in his eyes, while asserting that he wasn't going to die without a struggle. Immediately after, he activated his SS-ranked sword talent. Duck stood in all his splendor as he waited for it to land the first attack, while Namgung, who was on the floor, wished Duck could back off already because the beast wasn't one that could be defeated with an axe, speak less of a sword. He desperately wanted to advise Duck to run away, but Namgung's body kept failing him. The words wouldn't come out, and he felt responsible for everything. On the other hand, the beast reached out for Duck and almost gave him no head. But the next thing that happened was the swing of a sword, and everyone's face was filled with shock as they tried to process what they were seeing. It seemed Duck had successfully sliced off one of the beast's horns, and as it landed on the floor, he was somewhat encouraged to keep going because the first try was a gamble. Now, he felt like he could cut this beast down, because even though this was his very first time holding a real sword, he felt the sword acting as a part of his body. Mr. Beast, on the other hand, wasn't exactly pleased that his horn was cut off, so he certainly was going to get revenge and started by running toward Duck. But before he could do anything at all, Duck had slashed his arm multiple times and caused him to bleed. Even Namgung couldn't believe his eyes because there was no way on earth Duck had successfully delivered 6 consecutive slashes in one breath. He concluded that Duck wasn't the martial artist he thought he was, but a swordsman. But despite all of Duck's impressive slashes, the beast stood in one piece, almost like nothing had an effect on him. Duck realized that his cuts were too shallow, and that this beast had thick and fat meat everywhere. The jealous fat pig behind the barrier was glad that Duck failed to kill the beast, and said his skill wasn't sufficient enough to protect them from imminent death. But Namgung knew that was absolute cap because Duck's skills were obvious even to a blind man, and his swordsmanship like the prices of the East. The skills weren't the problem, but the weapon was, and Duck's weapon was about to break. He knew it wouldn't last long, just like all you 1-minute chaps, but he had to slash the beast's vital spots at least once. That being said, he attacked the beast at full speed and deigned its punches to deliver some powerful blows and kicks using his martial arts talent. As usual, these attacks had no effect on the beast, but Duck had somehow sent his sword flying at the beast's eye. Boss dodged it by a hair strand and was angry for no reason at all, but Duck was able to land a kick on its jaw that caused a bloody injury. After, he recovered his sword and spread his legs wide enough for the beast to suck on his beef stick, and then he activated the swordsmanship talent while still in the air. With all his strength, Duck landed his sword on the beast and smashed it into the ground, but his sword had already taken way too many injuries for him to be comfortable, and any move he made from that point may be his final chance at getting rid of this tiring beast. All Duck desperately wanted now was an opening, so when the monster squatted to take a dump, Duck's eyes were lit with excitement because he had a thing for monster chocolate. He eventually found the opening he needed, but Namgung was terrified because this was the same technique that the beast used to defeat them earlier. However, he saw that Duck was dead serious about his next move, and was going to take this beast head-on. While the atmosphere was charged with 2 different forms of energy about to collide, Namgung got up and was ready to help Duck in whatever way he could. He suddenly recalled the advice Duck had given him earlier in the goblin's room, so he motioned to his most useless follower and told him it was finally his time to shine because there was something long, hard and useful underneath his robe. On the other hand, Duck was steadying himself to strike at the monster's vital point once and for all, so both monster and man stared hard at each other for a final time. And when the monster made the first move, Duck equally charged towards him, going underneath the beast's swing to land an attack on the monster's chest. Unfortunately, he found out that sword had finally snapped and the beast was still alive, so Duck dropped his sword defeatedly as he acknowledged that naught was all over for him. At the same time, the monster was about to transform Duck into the nicest human-flavored barbecue on earth. But suddenly, from the blue, a sword appeared in Duck's hand, which was thrown to him by none other than the once useless guild member, who had turned a new leaf and was even encouraging Duck to get rid of the beast. Right before the beast's scepter could land on Duck, he successfully landed his sword right in the 6-packed belly of the beast. Fast forward 5 hours later, when no more monsters were crawling out of the dungeon, but suddenly the outsiders saw humans coming out of the dungeon and were relieved. As they stepped out, Duck asked Namgung how he knew that he could catch a sword without looking, so the old man said it was all because of what Duck had said about being able to fight without seeing. Duck thanked them for coming to his rescue, but Namgung said it was he who rescued them. The guild leader told him to hurry up because he was the #1 contributor to the dungeon, but Duck couldn't believe his ears because all his life he'd been tagged a loser and hopeless fool. But now he had a new identity and had finally defeated his father's loser DNA. So he lifted his fist to celebrate his victory and was joined by the watching crowd. Afterwards and much later, Duck came down to the hospital to check on his mom. So he briefly checked her bed and found her lying okay, which brought him instant relief. His attention was drawn to a news report saying they interviewed him as the largest contributor to the dungeon. But Duck squeezed his face like he was trying to birth a baby elephant. And he was too dumb to understand the questions they asked, so he just told them all to calm down and said that to him. Guilds and divisions didn't matter, but he only fought with his last ounce of strength to protect someone who was dear to him. At this point, Duck could no longer watch himself being a brain rot on international TV, so he turned it off. He saw a picture of himself in action on his cracked phone, which still looked better than whatever you're holding, but right then a status window popped up, notifying him that he'd now gained fame and his divine power had increased to 1,000. Seeing this, he remembered that the divine power was the qualification written on a certain job advertisement, so even the system confirmed that he could open a new job ad, and he didn't hesitate to begin immediately. The ad opened, and this time around, the employer was Hephaestus, who was seeking to recruit a security manager. So Duck felt like this would be a piece of cake for him, but for now he was pretty tired of running, so he just wanted to get home and rest for a bit before going for the job. However, the system quickly notified him that 3 gods had already applied for the job, so that was his final chance. Duck was surely devastated and refused to let this piece of cake job go to anyone else, so he quickly clicked on apply. And as rudely as possible, he was teleported to an unknown destination in the rudest manner. The location was Hephaestus's fiery forge, and the temperature was so hot it felt like the devil's reception and almost melted his worries away. He nagged about Hephaestus being too broke to afford an air conditioning unit, but suddenly some huge guys appeared from behind him, asking if he was the new job applicant, and then he introduced himself as Hephaestus. This hypocritical fool immediately jumped off and stammered a greeting as he bowed to the god. But Hef laughed at him and wondered why he was greeting like a bloody human. Duck knew he had messed up by nagging about the AC and only hoped he wouldn't get buried alive. But Hef remained as positive as ever and introduced himself as the god of blacksmiths. Thereafter, he called Duck the god of mountains and commended him for his immense love for humans, which made him fight in Thor's dungeon without fear. This also showed that Thor loved Duck like his own sugar boy because he had guts like never seen before. Duck was thinking he got away with the talk about the AC, but it turns out Hephaestus heard it all and found his guts really funny. So Duck just apologized with his head buried in the floor. Anyway, it was time to get down to business, and Hef had to explain Duck's tasks to him. He brought out a mythical horn and blew on it. But then he sucked on it even harder that Duck felt the hottest sensation running down his spine. Suddenly, 3 dwarf buff daddies appeared, and he asked them to greet Duck because he'd be the new working manager from that day forth. They greeted him in a bored position and said they'd be at his service till whenever. Duck thanked them, saying he wasn't accustomed to working in a smithy, but Hephaestus said there was no need for them to be so humble because even newbies could deliver excellently. Anyway, Hef told him that the dwarves were highly skilled but crafty and had an attitude problem like your short girlfriend. Apparently, Hef had been losing valuable items when he got involved in tedious tasks, items as valuable as the pendant he got for Freya as a gift. Even Duck was surprised that they had the nerve to steal from Freya, and Hef said that was even the biggest problem. One of the dwarves was eavesdropping on their conversation, and Hef said he would be traveling to Mount Olympus for a day, and so he handed Duck Hercule's club, which possessed the ability to stun all living creatures. Duck himself knew that the item was too OP for a lowly beggar like himself, but that was when Hef summoned a fiery portal and decided to leave him. Unfortunately, Duck still had no precise knowledge of his expected duties, but Hef said there was no reason to worry as long as he was stronger than the bunch of softies. As soon as Hef left, Duck was left alone, and the dwarf eavesdropping on their conversation showed up with a hammer of some sort. Duck felt the guy was there to say hi, but this one wasn't even smiling and looked like he brought trouble along. Judging from the dude's expression, Duck knew this dude didn't want peace and had chosen violence, so he internally thanked Hephaestus for giving him Hercules' club as a precautionary measure. He calmly told the dwarves to relax and chill out because he had a super cool weapon that may hurt them. But to his utmost shock, these dudes brought out some huge guns and made it clear to him that they weren't his playmates. Duck knew it was all over for him when their leads calmly drew on his cigar and bade him goodbye in Latin. Moments later, Duck gradually regained consciousness and overheard the guys talking about selling something, although he even found it a miracle that he was alive in the first place. Anyway, he caught a blurry image of 2 dwarves with one of them holding a pendant, and that was created by Hephaestus for god Freya. Duck wasn't pleased with this, but there was very little he could do when he was tied to a pillar. The dwarves were surprised to find that Duck was awake so early, even after being shot with a strong tranquilizer gun. But he mocked how fearless they were for thinking they'd survive stalking from one of the most powerful gods of Olympus in his own house. He gave them one last chance to release him before matters became more serious. But they suddenly burst out laughing at him and said if they were really scared of Hephaestus, they wouldn't have started stealing from him in the first place. Just then, one of the dwarves called upon the others, saying they'd gathered everything worth money from Hephaestus, so they should slowly prepare to leave. All they needed to do was give Duck one more shot of the tranquilizer before leaving, but they didn't see the pocket knife in Duck's hands. Anyway, the dwarves mocked the whole situation because Hephaestus shouldn't have sent someone as limp as that wimp to be a part-timer, as it only made their work super easy. Duck warned them that they'd regret their actions, but the guys just kept laughing at him like hired clowns. However, Duck suddenly set himself loose and using his club, he whooped their flat buns silly and sent them flying in the air. By the time he was done with them, they were both tied down and looking like the greatest fools of all time. Duck wasn't glad that he had to resort to violence, but he thanked the adventurer from earlier for advising him to have a weapon on him at all times. Just there, he saw something shiny, which was the pendant made for Freya, but on the other wing, the dwarves were loading up bars of precious minerals, including all the armor, all under their boss's supervision. It was now time for them to go, but two bald fools were already turned on and couldn't wait to shove those fat rods into the rear ends of their gut. When they were Dione, the boss stood up to deliver a speech and began, saying they were a tribe endowed with the spirit of the burning mountains, who were the best miners and warriors. Unknown to them, Duck had already slipped in through their gathering, and he heard the boss saying that they'd been working for rewards, but had never been treated with respect by the boss Hephaestus, and he'd instead humiliated them, so stealing from him was their revenge. As he watched this circus display, Duck wasn't sure what was really up with those bald dudes reminding him of a crate of eggs, so he caught their attention, and they instantly drew out the guns against him, firing sporadically as he tried to escape. He was rather confused because he didn't understand why these species of dwarves were delighted in shooting him, and realized that Hephaestus was wrong to call them a bunch of softies. The boss dwarf remained calm after seeing that Duck managed to escape, so he drew out a smoke and told him that they'd be wiping the entire place clean. However, they hated Hephaestus and not him, so they won't want him dead, and he could either join them to loot the place and become their accomplice or return home and pretend nothing ever happened. For Duck, running away wasn't an option because his reputation would be destroyed, and then he may never be hired for any part-time jobs in the future after all he went through to get that ability. Even worse, Hephaestus might be so mad at him and end his life when he sees that his entire smithy had been robbed. So Duck decided that he'd have to fight these guys to death, or be murdered by the notorious dwarves. He began crying and mourning his death already, so he stepped from behind the pillar in a surrender position, and the boss dwarf referred to him as a filthy low-class god. Anyway, Duck asked him why they were going so far even though they were supposed to be Hephaestus's partners, and he also asked what they felt Hephaestus would do if he, being one of the greatest gods, found out that they were doing such things. Duck felt Hephaestus would throw them into a furnace alive and watch them burn to ashes. However, while he was still talking, a bullet flew right past his fingers and the blonde dwarf told him to shut his effing trap up, and that he no longer deserved mercy for running that dumpster he called a mouth. The guys were ready to end him on the spot when their boss took over the conversation and was visibly mad, mostly because Duck dared to call Hephaestus the great craftsman. He made it clear that Duck was ignorant of the truth and decided to tell him the truth before turning him into a corpse. Boldly, he stated that Hephaestus's crafts were nothing but trash, and this revelation took Duck by surprise. The boss dwarf said Hephaestus was even better called a thief, and he further affirmed this by telling the real story about Hephaestus. The god apparently visited the dwarves in the mountains one day and said their tools were amazing, and if they agreed to work with him, he'd give them everything they needed. After they followed him to his smithy, they essentially became his slaves, even though they only worked for 6 hours and for only 5 days a week. This perfect life made them waste away in enjoyment, and they didn't notice that their passionate souls were being torn apart. Instead of Hephaestus, all the wealth and honor they worked for would have belonged to them, and that meant Hephaestus was nothing short of a thief. After realizing that there were no more dwarves with the spirit of craftsmanship, the boss dwarf decided it was time for them all to get revenge. Duck said he understood their plight, and that the boss dwarf was actually trash because he was jealous of the achievements of those superior to him, so he went as far as ruining everything. The boss dwarf wasn't satisfied with his response and was ready to break Duck if that was all he had to say. But the guy held his hands out and told them to stop and listen to him until the very end. He said other people would get the wrong idea and think of the dwarves as thieves, so he asked if the dwarves, who were such great craftsmen and proud warriors, could bear such shame. Hearing such fine names that Duck called them seemed to be working for the boss, so Duck went on to add that there was a better way for them to take revenge on Hephaestus. The weapon in his hand was made by Hephaestus, and he was just one man, and if they called to be great craftsmen and proud warriors, they'd forget about the silly guns they were holding and compete against him with the actual weapons they made with their own hands. The idea was for them to beat the warrior holding Hephaestus's weapon, because that was the best way to humiliate the god and take revenge. But the other option was to accept that Hephaestus was greater than them and yeet the smithy like spineless cowards. Hearing this, the blonde dude was shocked at Duck's guts to play mind games even when he was on the brink of death. So he raised his gun to end the brat once and for all while telling the boss that Duck wasn't worth listening to. Again, Duck found himself saying his last prayers for the 100th time in a day. But everything changed when the boss, who called himself the Great Red Fist, couldn't accept that he was just going to run away from Hephaestus. He told Duck that he made a really great speech with his running mouth, and Duck was glad that the man fell for the bait. This made the man agree to spar with Duck, but he said Duck would have to take responsibility for daring to call an insect like himself a warrior. So if Duck couldn't last long enough to prove that the dwarves' weapons were better than his own, he'd beat Duck to a pulp and make sure his bones turned into powder. Immediately, the dwarf mounted his giant hammer and aimed straight for Duck. But Duck dodged the attack and watched the little explosion that he would have been victim to. He immediately saw that the dwarf's weapon was so powerful that it destroyed a pillar, and the boss asked why he was surprised and whether he was expecting them to lose against him simply because they were no longer fighting with guns. Proudly, he held his hammer behind himself as he called Duck a filthy, lowly god, but he was surprised to hear Duck boldly claim that he stood a chance against them and hoped they wouldn't be surprised at the result. With incredible speed, Duck dashed towards the dwarf and almost landed his club right on his chest, but the lucky dwarf dodged the attack and slammed Duck with the hammer. Unfortunately, Duck was right behind him, and what he thought he saw was actually Duck's afterimage. Again, he attacked, but Duck was way ahead of him, leaving him in shock at his incredible speed. However, Duck said there was more shock awaiting him, and he moved to attack a vulnerable spot on the dwarf's body. The other guys felt it was all over for their boss, but Duck was kicked heavily on the shoulder, and when they separated from each other, he applauded the boy dwarf's skills because that kick felt really personal as it was still hurting him. The dwarf boss hailed Duck for talking real good and advised that he understand his limits as a swordsman. Duck was surprised that the dwarf knew he was a swordsman, but the boss said it was really obvious because of how good Duck was with the blunt weapon in his hands. He complimented Duck's sword skills and said he was getting stiff just from seeing how good Duck was with his weapon. In fact, he said Duck was either superior or an equal to himself, and this made his heart race with excitement. The other dwarves watching this couldn't believe that the scrawny little brat in front of them was that powerful, while their boss took off his shirt and apologized for underestimating Duck because now he was ready to use the limits of his full power. He took off with great speed and lifted his giant hammer towards Duck. But the boy blocked the attack with his club, and they were even. They kept on sparring over and over again while entertaining the dwarves, who were so excited and had their hearts racing as they watched a battle between the strong men. The sound of iron clashing against iron reminded them of the craft they proudly called their own. The vibration in the air and the familiar sound of the smithy, combined with the hammer of Duck's fire slamming against their souls, reminded him of the soul of a blacksmith. The boss dwarf couldn't refute Duck's words when he accused him of being jealous of Hephaestus because he realized that he was the incompetent one and had been taking out his anger on Hephaestus, who was more competent. The very day Hephaestus welcomed them to his place, the dwarves were filled with deep joy and gratitude because someone had finally recognized them from the dirt. But when they saw how good Hephaestus's crafts were, they became aware of their inadequacies and became pathetic, leading to the string of events that followed. He acknowledged that everything was a waste of time and that he was completely defeated, even as Duck used the club to hit the hammer away from his hands. With tears in his eyes, the boss dwarf accepted that he had lost, right as he waited for Duck's weapon to smash him to death for good. However, a mighty hand stopped the attack midway, and it belonged to the mighty Hephaestus, who told Duck to hold it. He said the whole house had gone to crap because he was gone for a minute, so much so that he thought he was in the wrong house, and so he'd like to know exactly what transpired in his absence. Hephaestus said he knew they'd fight, but didn't expect to come home and meet such a mess. But right now, what he needed was an explanation for the goods that were about to be stolen from him. He asked the boss dwarf directly, and the small man was so scared that he almost pooped himself. So he kneeled down and took responsibility for them, saying the other dwarves had nothing to do with it. However, the other men were shocked to see their captain take the blame for them. Hephaestus then asked the reason why the captain had his goods out there. So despite the impending consequences of his action, the captain began to confess that he was going to rob Hephaestus. However, Duck immediately stepped in and said it was he who led the dwarf to make such a decision. But even the dwarf couldn't believe what Duck was doing. Hephaestus was shocked and said he'd entrusted Duck with guarding the smithy, so he wanted to hear an explanation for his actions. He stammered for a bit and first showed Hephaestus the precious pendant that was missing. But the moment Red Fist saw this, he remembered that it was he who gave those boys the job of watching it for him. At this point, he knew that if Duck exposed the other guys for stealing the pendant, there would be much bigger trouble than he could control. He thought they were all done for, but Duck surprisingly said the captain found the pendant for him when he sent him to inspect all the warehouses. Also, since he had a small body, the captain could fit into every nook and cranny, which was where he found the pendant. Hephaestus asked if that was the turn, and the Red Fist stuttered a bit, scared of lying to the god, so a brief moment of silence ensued. Quite surprisingly, Hephaestus burst out laughing, saying he didn't care about the full story because Duck at least took good care of the smithy and helped to find the pendant, so he was pleased. Duck heaved a sigh of relief, and from behind him, Hephaestus tapped him on the shoulder and said he was a good guy, and that was probably why Thor liked him. The next thing his eyes moved to was the hammer, but he only said that he was initially worried about the dwarves because he thought they were no longer motivated to be blacksmiths. But this amazing hammer proved otherwise, and he could hear it colliding Hercules' club, even from Mount Olympus, and had no single scratch. To Hephaestus, the hammer had now become a better weapon than before, and he always looked forward to their hammering. Hearing this, the dwarves were moved to tears and all became sober, while Hephaestus turned his attention to Duck and told him that he did a great job guarding the place and even helped him to find the necklace. He created a portal and brought out a small treasure box which he presented to Duck as a token of gratitude. But Duck recognized that this reward was similar to the one given for clearing higher rank quests, and he felt this was too much for him, but he said was impolite for him to reject it. He gladly thanked Hephaestus and collected the box, but was surprised to find some strange monster-looking creature. However, Hephaestus told him to look closer, and when he did, he saw that it was a baby fox. But he still didn't understand why the god was giving him a pet monster when he never confessed his wild furry fantasies. Anyway, Hephaestus held the fox since Duck didn't seem to want it, and then he whispered in the fox's ears all the nasty things he was going to do to it that night. The fox suddenly started glowing brightly and eventually transformed into the most majestic sword ever, and Hephaestus said it was a shame that Duck didn't want all of that goodness. Duck was really surprised, and Hephaestus added that the fox could transform into many more weapons, including a sword, a scythe, or a spear. In summary, the monster was the essence of all weapons, and it could transform into any weapon in the universe as long as the weapon was about the same size as the fix. Essentially, the fox was very precious as he was a goddess's treasure. He repeated that it was a shame Duck didn't like it, and he'd gift it to the dwarves, but Duck quickly chimed in and said there was no way he could refuse a present bestowed upon him by Hephaestus. The god reminded Duck that he acted as if he didn't need it, but Duck said he was only refusing the gift out of politeness. He collected the pet and promised to take good care of him, and then he named him Snow White. But we're not going to talk about how creepy the name choice is. They both started getting friendly with each other when a hand suddenly reached out and transferred the ownership of the Moonlight Fox over to Duck. Anyway, that was all Duck's now, and Hephaestus said he had even more loot in his warehouse for Duck. For now, it was time for them to part ways, so Hephaestus opened the portal, sending Duck back along with a load of junk. Right before he left, Red Fist interrupted his departure and asked him what he liked to save their buns, even though they had earlier intended to end his life. He said it was because seeing them in that state reminded him of his pathetic past life. Red Fist asked if that was the only reason, and if he wanted something in exchange for his cooperation. But Duck said there was no need for that because people lived to help one another after all. Besides, Hephaestus probably knew the truth from the very beginning but decided to let everything go. As Duck took his leave, Red Fist was touched by his words, so he bowed on behalf of the dwarven tribe. And then he told them to return to hammering each other all night long. As for Duck, he was teleported back to the city with his loot, so he went straight to the Hunter department store to cash out. At the store, he met a guy named B who'd been working as the Hunter manager for ages, and recently became the general manager of the largest Hunter department store in the country. This dude thought he had Michael Jordan's riz, so he felt he could now dress nicely and hang with the top G's as besties, as his new position demanded such elegance. Right then, his self-indulgence was interrupted by Duck, and he was certainly dissatisfied to see a pathetic-looking beggar like Duck at such a pristine place. He wondered if Duck was even a hunter, with a pet so tiny and not even a hint of armor around him. B had seen so many guys like Duck, and they were usually some silly hunter wannabes who'd scavenge the remnants from dungeons and bring their trash for exchange. Anyway, the guy welcomed him into the store and led him to the appraisal center, where he was handed over to some level-headed looking papa. The guy began by inspecting the items Duck brought for exchange and was extremely shocked to see a certain item. So he asked Duck where he got it from, and Duck said he just got those random gifts from someone he knew. This made B angry, and he began yelling at Duck for bringing cheap random stuff to his store. So he went on to ask the older man what Duck brought, and the man said that in his entire 40 years of working there, that was the very first time anyone would refer to such precious items as random, because they were the highest quality of 4-star equipment. The manager couldn't believe his ears and wondered how such a soy boy could have laid his hands on such goodies. Anyway, he had to lead Duck to the VIP room, so when they got there, the older man shared that Duck could get about 3 billion won if he sold everything there. Duck felt excited because he initially heard that he'd be earning 300 million won, but his slow brain rebooted, and he realized that he'd be earning 3 billion won. Instantly, he went through a million stages of emotions as he tried to process that the random stuff Hephaestus had casually discarded were that expensive. The valuer even added that the items could be more expensive than that depending on the number of buyers and sellers. Watching this, the manager realized that the highest quality equipment that could be sold at any price was right in front of him. So even if he had to lick Duck's sweaty baby jewels, he'd do so to secure the rights to sell the items. He jumped right into simping and told Duck that if he really wanted to sell them all, he could hit him up. Before he even finished his statement, Duck said he'd sell them all, and the manager was happy, celebrating that the heavens must have sent this man his way, and he'd soon get another promotion. But his joy was dead sooner when Duck said he won't sell his items at that store, because of the manager's hypocritical behavior. Eventually, B lost his position as the manager within only a week of his promotion. As for Duck, he eventually sold all of his items, and his account balance dazzled him because for the first time in his worthless life, he had more zeros in his account than all you broke losers combined. He also realized that he smelled like skunk, so he decided to return home to freshen himself. Also, now that he was a billionaire, it was time for him to reward himself, and he'd head to visit his mum tomorrow in the hospital. The day eventually arrived, and Duck's mum was extremely surprised that he'd turned up with tons of presents for her. But one of the patients told her she apparently wasn't watching enough TV. She did turn it on for her, and Duck's mum was shocked to hear that her son was thought to possess the best class of talent in the country, and that he'd cleared an entire dungeon. Duck humbly said he didn't achieve that alone, but his mum's friend told him to shut up and sign his autograph on her sagging rice cakes. As for his mum, she wasn't even aware that her son possessed any talent at all, but he simply told her that he got it recently and everything happened really quickly. Suddenly, Duck's mum collapsed on the table, which got him worried, but it seemed she was so overcome by her joy that she broke down, shedding happy tears. She was excited, and Duck tried to comfort her, but he remembered that his mum always blamed herself for him not having a talent. On the news, Nangung was being interviewed about Duck, and he said some pretty nice things about Duck, which made his mum proud of her son. However, Duck realized that this was an opportunity because fame would grant him more divine power, which he could accumulate to gain access to more part-time jobs. Right now, he'd picked a part-time job to exterminate a spirit. His employer was Michael, and he'd be rewarded with a golden apple, which was a fruit that granted the gods immortality. Duck was eager because that fruit could help cure his mum's cancer, but his thoughts were disrupted by breaking news. It said that a new gate had opened in some city nearby, and inhabitants were ordered to evacuate. The moment this news was announced, Snow White started acting strangely and hid in Duck's sweater. There was an ominous aura around the fox, and the moment Duck touched it, he was drawn into an alternate reality for a moment. When he was back to Earth, Duck was confused as heck about what just happened. But the newscaster continued to share that this dungeon was different because it didn't permit humans to enter, yet monsters could keep coming out of it. Because of the illusion, he just saw Duck had to bid his mum goodbye and dashed out of the hospital. On the other hand, some ugly goblins had started coming out of the dungeon, and again, soldiers were trying to get rid of them. But luckily, Duck showed up that minute at the gate and was ready to walk in. So far, the soldiers had done a good job defeating most of the goblins, so they were tired and wanted to take a break before the next wave of monsters came in. But the commander told them not to rest too easy so the paparazzi wouldn't catch them sleeping on duty. Right then, one of them looked up, spotted someone's silhouette, and wondered if it was a person. He quickly ran to meet the captain, who attacked him for getting out of his formation. But the soldier told him to look up, and they both saw Duck's form. The commander wondered why there was a civilian in a restricted spot, and then he told the numbskull to hurry up and fetch the civilian on time. The reporters watching this were confused about what was going on. But when they found out that a civilian made it to the restricted area, they accused the captain of being incompetent and said he got his promotion by wrapping his tongue around the boss's soggy stick. When he heard it, he ran over to check on Duck, but kept yapping as he headed there and eventually activated a skill known as the Wind, which took him to the top of the cliff much faster. Upon his arrival, he told Duck to stop playing and get the heck out of that place already. He also assumed Duck was a YouTuber, so he told him to give up on his dead career and go take videos of chickens or something. Because Duck had little to no expression, the idiotic soldier thought that the guy was intimidated by his strength as a 3-star hunter, and sure, he went on to brag and even offer his autograph. However, he soon got humiliated when Duck ignored his existence and said he was there to do something and needed some time. This pissed the man off, and he confronted Duck by grabbing his arm and asking how he had the guts to ignore him. He found it strange that Duck survived the strong arm pull, but soon burst out laughing because he couldn't believe that a rando with no future was looking down on him, with nothing to his name but a disgusting pet. He decided to teach Duck a lesson, so he aimed a punch at his face, but Duck dodged it. Instead, he caused the man to trip with his foot, and the guy went flying over the cliff. However, the Grim Reaper had to take a fat L because Duck chose to save that ugly son of a skunk, and then he apologized. He made him trip by accident. On the other hand, he asked if it was right that a 3-star hunter, who should be leading by example, was throwing fists at civilians. The hunter returned the favor by calling Duck all sorts of names and claiming to be an important figure, when even his parents denied him. He threw another punch that ended up being useless, so Duck asked him if he was continuing in such a pointless fight because he himself was game. It was when he called his attention to the fact that people were watching both of them that the hunter realized Duck's plan all along. As soon as the cameras were on him, people recognized Duck as the famous guy known for clearing the dungeon. And that was when this stupid hunter also realized that he had been messing with the wrong guy. Duck made a statement and asked the reporters to keep taking pictures because good news was waiting at the end of the day. He then turned his attention to the hunter and reminded him about what he called him, which was a random guy with no head or tail. Anyway, it's time for him to watch and see just what a random guy could do. Right in front of everyone who jumped off the cliff in a flying position together with Snow White, and then he flew into the gate of the dungeon. This was like a blockbuster for everyone because no human had ever gotten into the gates in over 10 years, but Duck defied the odds and made it in. This phenomenon was different from dungeons because only weak monsters ever came out of its gates, and they occasionally disappeared. Now that Duck had gotten it, it only happened to be possible because he was the lowest class god, so the Eye of the Abyss would be watching out for him. Also, Duck remembered this fate from Snow's memory and realized that if it was a god who made it, then it meant only gods could gain access. However, he only wanted to understand why humans weren't permitted into the gate like the dungeons that Thor created to test humans. But first of all, he had to go on a tour of the place. After walking for some time, he encountered an access point and placed his hands on it. But the system denied him entrance because he lacked sufficient divine power to make it through. The idiot either didn't understand simple instructions or was just trying to prove his tomfoolery, so he used every form of force and even tried kicking the door in, but got the very same message at each attempt. After 1 million reminders that he was nothing but a loser, he gave up and was frustrated because at this point there was no way he could even get out without the divine part, meaning he was stuck. He then sat on the floor with his pet since he had no better thing doing with his life, and he decided to just hang around with Snow White. But that instant, he turned his attention to a dungeon that he had been ignoring, and since he had nothing else done, He decided it was time to see which monsters were there and who owned the gate. A few minutes later, Duck was already regretting his decision because there were way too many goblins that he had to deal with. Unlike the other dungeons that he could easily clear by defeating the boss, this one seemed particularly challenging for Duck, and he was clueless about what to do to clear it. Also, the monsters in other dungeons were programmed to fight, but these monsters here seemed to have a mind and consciousness of their own. On the plus side, Duck was glad that his divine power would surely increase since he had managed to enter the gate, and if he finally succeeded in clearing it, he'd certainly get tons of multiples of divine power. Unfortunately, while he was getting carried away, some mutant berserk form of monster showed up behind him and launched a surprise attack. Finally, he found the gate's monster, and he sure as heck looked like the pictorial representation of torture. But something just didn't feel right about this dude, and it wasn't clear if it was because he was drooling for a guy as ugly as Duck, or if it was those creepy hula hoops on his ears. Before Duck had a chance to figure the weirdness out, the monster growled, rushing towards Duck. But he was so slow that Duck would have finished watching One Piece in slow-mo about 5-10 times before he arrived. This was rather disappointing, and Duck even wondered if this was the actual boss, so he took him off guard and snapped his sword. But this dude was still too slow to realize that his sword was broken. At the same time, Duck's fix turned into a sword, and he quickly sliced through the chest of the boss monster in one slash. As the beast fell to the ground, Duck found it unbelievable that it was dead, just like that. And since there was barely any message from the system, it wasn't so great because no one would believe he cleared the gate. Anyway, he decided to extract the best score for evidence of his achievement, and based on some random YouTube tutorial he watched earlier, he butchered this dude like he was a cadaver, and then extracted some dark, ugly core. This was somewhat surprising because most other cores would be gem-like and twinkly, but this particular one felt like it was moving. As a matter of fact, the thing soon jiggled off his hand and beat his finger, so he let it go but eventually stabbed it with his sword. The moment he did that, a status window finally appeared, stating that he had now collected the gate, and so the gate would now permanently vanish. And that was it. Just like that, the thing that tormented the people of that town for ages was finally going to disintegrate all by itself. On the other side of it, humans were wondering what was going on inside the gate, and if it was true that someone really went inside. Some scientist lady asked the doctor if they should try stopping the people from finding out because it would be chaotic if the world knew that someone actually went into that forbidden area. And, even worse, there'd be criticism from prominent dungeon investigators if things became even crazier. Right in the middle of their conversation, however, Duck popped out of the dungeon's portal, stunning everyone who witnessed this. They were shocked that a human actually came out of the gate and started bombarding him with questions about how he got in there in the first place. The scientist lady was more shocked than anyone else because dude was popping in and out of the entrance like he was hula hooping, but Duck himself couldn't care less and was just glad to enjoy some fresh air. However, more questions were thrown at him, and some even thought he was deceiving them, but he told him to calm down and said the most important thing was that henceforth humanity could obstruct the gate by themselves. The message still wasn't clear to them, but Duck was glad because the reactions were encouraging, so he lifted his sword and showed them the core he extracted from the gate's boss monster. This squiggly thing kept screaming back and forth, but Duck swiftly sliced through it with his sword multiple times, leading to the gradual destruction and disintegration of the gate, although the whole thing resembled a preschooler's artwork for some reason. This shocked everyone in attendance of the event because the gate had vanished just like that. But for Duck, it was a moment of self-appreciation, because that was the coolest thing he ever did so far. The scientist lady could not believe that in all her Einstein years, something like this could ever happen, and it was so crazy that she had to turn back and question who this lucky slobber was. Anyway, that was a question Duck was willing to answer 1 billion times, so he said his name in front of everyone, and news of his conquest spread far and wide, making him the only trending subject on every platform. The haters would hate, of course, but Duck's divine power just kept increasing up until he'd accumulated a total of 10,000 points and upgraded to the rank of a lower-class god. He was busy trying to read his system's messages, but these darned paparazzi wouldn't give him a break and kept asking him pointless questions that would certainly not end in him getting laid. By some twist of fate, the hottest legs in this story appeared and belonged to some obviously important female. Her bouncers tried pushing through the crowd, and one person even tried fighting back until he turned and took a second look at who the person really was. It turns out that it was a lady from the Sangoon Guild who had come to inform Duck that Namgung was looking for him. For a moment, Duck was speechless and beheld those glorious pillars belonging to the guild's future master and 7-star hunter named Soil. Moments later, Duck found himself at the Samgoon Guild and couldn't help but marvel at how impressive the building was. While he relaxed and waited for the guild master, he wasn't sure if they called for him because of the recent news and if they were trying to scout him. Even more surprising was the fact that Soil personally visited him to invite him by herself, despite her rank and fame in the country and globally at large. Anyways, this was good for him because he had been hoping for some time to check something out. He visited the pastime window and was welcomed as a low-class god who had now unlocked new abilities, such as the power, symbol, and title systems, respectively. The system asked if he would like to load the titles he could choose and imagine if it was going to sound as nice as Thor, the god of thunder, or Ares, the god of war. He was giddied up as it was time for him to confirm what title he'd choose, but the system only suggested the god of only fans, fly swatters, water bottles, or the god of chairs, because that was only as good as he would ever get. He couldn't believe this disrespect, despite all the riz he had managed to get overnight. He could just imagine himself as a god of flyswatter, and couldn't accept how ridiculous he looked. So he decided to keep swiping until he found a good one up until he found something really surprisingly good, which was the god of swords. He was happy because that suited his talents very well and nicely, and so he confirmed his decision to be titled the Sword God, after which the system accepted this choice and some weird freaky stuff popped out of the window, implanting right into his chest. That moment Duck was overpowered, and his entire body was enveloped by a power that completely filled the room. Some seconds later, everything stopped, and Duck felt like he just survived a heart attack, but the system only notified him that he had just been enthroned as the Sword God, and was blessed by an unknown goddess. This feeling in his body reminded him of the same thing that happened when he gained his talent. But then the system also notified him that he had now unlocked the power system, and so he should choose the power for the Sword God. The screen was flooded with tons of choices for Duck to choose from, but he couldn't believe his new reality because he was finally going to use the power of a god. He saw a sword Kai, which would channel divine power into the sword and make it so powerful that it could cut through anything. He knew there was nothing to worry about, considering that he wasn't buying anything expensive from God's store, and everything would be his own by the time he reached honest levels. Unfortunately, there were no dramatic abilities among the powers he could choose first, so he went on with the power of intuition for his first abilities. Duck's profile was soon updated with his newly applied stats, and the power of intuition he got could unlock a sixth sense other than the physical ones. He was over and beyond with excitement, because now his profile finally looks like a god's profile, and he had skills that he couldn't wait to check out. But just then he was interrupted by a knock on the door, so he thought it was the bouncer that had let him in and stood up to get the door. He saw that it was Soil, so she asked if she could come in for a masturbate, and dude fumbled the bag was busy asking stupid questions instead of spreading those legs wide already. Before she moved any further, she handed him a card from the guild master which served as an exclusive pass of the guild and permitted him to use any form of luxury belonging to the guild. Duck wondered if this was all part of her recruiting strategy, but he thanked her for the pass anyway. The lady had less reactions than Nezuko, even when he thanked her for a second time, but he eventually accepted that awkward silence was going to be the love language in this relationship with a super weird lady. He was just about to return inside when Snow turned wild as his eyes landed on a fresh pair of booby traps, so he hopped onto her chest. This was way too much for Duck to watch because he wished it was him, but then he apologized for the fox's unexpected behavior. However, Soil calmly petted him and told Duck that the animal was very cute, and then she offered to give it a snack. As she fed Snow, Duck couldn't believe his eyes because the fox barely ever opened up to anyone. But for some strange reason, he was drawn to Soil. Perhaps the fox had a thing for pretty ladies, but that wasn't as strange as ever on Earth she was feeding him. When Snow White was done eating the nut, Soil said it was nice meeting Duck, and then she bid Snow White goodbye. After getting in, Duck was happy to be free from the awkwardness and asked Snow White why he had taken a liking to the strange woman. But he suddenly remembered that she specifically mentioned Snow White's name before she left, and Duck never even told her what his fox's name was. The only thing Duck could safely assume at this point was that Soil was stalking him, so he tried finding ways to deal with her. While he was deep in thought, a notification from the status window came in, and even though he desperately tried to ignore it, he had to check it out of frustration. It was a message stating that his desired part-time job had been modified. And this time around, the employer was Hades, who wanted someone to feed his dog. However, the payment for this job was doubled since there wasn't anyone applying for it, and Duck was certainly not going to let this one pass him by. He was beyond ready to go for this, so he clicked on confirm, ready to starve if he had to. As soon as he accepted the job, Duck was teleported to a dark, abandoned location. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face, and he saw a creepy, hooded figure with a lamp, which startled him off his bones. It was then that he realized that he was on a boat in the middle of nowhere. However, this creepy hooded figure on the other side seemed to be very surprised that Duck wasn't dead. He told Duck that he was on the Styx River, a place where the dead of the underworld were carried and could not be crossed by the living. When Duck heard this little story, he remembered it was a popular legend, and that the man in front of him was probably Charon the boatman. Ignoring his fears, Duck just told the man that he needed his help to cross the river and attend to other business, but he told him to return back. However, Duck asked how else he was supposed to meet Hades, but the man couldn't believe Duck had the guts to recklessly mention the name of Hades. Duck asked what else he was supposed to name the dude, because his name was Hades after all, except he was expecting Duck to address Hades by his title. Charon already had enough of Duck's stupidity, so he asked if he valued his life, but Duck told him he provoked him first. For the final time, he warned Duck and told him to return while he was lifting up his sickle, threatening that young, low-class gods like Duck also died from choking on his fat pole. It was at this point Duck realized that this Charon guy was the bad guy after all, so he ignored the warning and gave him his hot middle finger. The boatman was deeply offended by Duck's arrogance, and so he decided to end his life since that was all Duck had been asking for. However, when he swung toward Duck's neck, the boy dodged the attack and called on Snow White to transform into a weapon. Until this point, the dumb old boatman still didn't know just how powerful Duck was and kept yapping some insensible threats to him. But the next time he swung the sickle at Duck's neck, he ended up with a broken sickle. It was then his senses returned to him, and he was surprised to see what Duck was holding in his hands. Duck asked him if he knew what it was, and he said he certainly did because that was Hercules' club and Hercules was the only human who defeated him and crossed the river alive. But while he was still talking, Duck smacked him right on the head and told him to stop talking too much because he had other things to do with his time. Boatman had become humble at this point, so he asked Duck to at least pay the rowing fees, but Duck looked at him just once and he knew the maniac wasn't joking, so he agreed to go right away. Eventually, they arrived at shore and Duck thanked him for the ride, so he turned his back to him as he climbed out of the boat. But the cowardly boatman seized this opportunity to attack Duck while he wasn't looking, and at that precise moment, Duck's power of intuition was activated, so he rapidly dodged the swing of Charon's sickle. This made the coward really shocked, but Duck was equally shocked because this power of intuition made his body move faster than he was able to think. He decided to be petty and beat the life out of the dumb boatman who was already pissing his eyes out. Afterwards he finished up, and a young lady asked if he was the part-time in charge of Cerberus. Apparently, this was Persephone, the goddess of the underworld and flowers, who explained that her husband Hades was angry when no one had applied, so it was a good thing that Duck came for the job. Anyways, she escorted him to the place where Cerberus was located, and on the journey, she explained that the dog was very far away. Before now, they could call Cerberus right to the front, but Hades stopped his wife from doing that because half of the previous part-timers ran away right after seeing Cerberus. It was rather surprising, because Hades expected these part-timers to be able to deal with Cerberus if they were at least able to deal with the boatman. All of this made Duck so nervous because, based on the myths he read, Cerberus was a fearsome monster known as the Warden of the Underworld. However, he reminded himself that there was nothing to be scared of because after all, he was the great sword god, and Cerberus was nothing but a dog after all. Eventually, they arrived at a fiery place with a monstrous beast raging with fire all over it. The moment Duck took a closer look at this terrifying three-headed beast, he knew it was high time he joined his dead father in heaven. Certainly, this wasn't what he had signed up for because Hades had hired him to babysit a puppy, but right now, he was seeing a rather unfriendly Digzilla. Seeing the look of nervousness on his face, Persephone asked Duck if he was okay at all, but he pretended he was okay, even though he'd already dispensed some organic chocolate in his pants. She held a scroll containing some warnings written by Hades himself, and as the Duck received it, he at least was glad that the god didn't let him deal with the monster without any warning. When he read the precautions, Duck saw that it was essentially useless because even Duck breathing near the monster was a threat to his life, and that was the summary of that list. Also, Persephone added that the daily schedule was written on the back page, so Duck had to strictly adhere to those instructions. This entailed Duck taking the dog on a walk after breakfast, lunch, and dinner each time, and it was the same as telling Duck to pick up a hacksaw and chop off his sausage. However, Persephone reminded him his endless rants won't save him now since he'd already taken the job, and he couldn't even escape because the last employee was caught running by Hades and dragged to meet the devil who ravaged his body from the front and back. After seeing all that load of difficult information to deal with, Duck realized that he was stuck in this bit, so he accepted his fate and picked up the paper he'd already torn apart, saying he made a mistake while trying to cheer himself up. The first thing he was to do was feed the monster with some meat in the storage. After toiling all night, Duck brought some heavy slices of his meat for the monster, and Persephone told him to throw them one after the other to Cerberus. Already the dog was drooling, because Duck's meat was looking so juicy that he just wanted to choke on it already. He noticed that the dogs had suddenly become so calm, but they just threw up on him and his little fix. Persephone seemed to be having fun in all these, and even told Duck that there was no point in training the dog because it only listened to Hades. Now he understood why no one applied for the job, and he decided to screw everything and threw the meat to dogs, causing it to accidentally land on the face of one of them. However, the other two started laughing and Duck flung the meat at their faces to punish them for laughing at their friend. This made Cerberus angry, so he charged angrily at Duck and came within an inch of biting his head off while struggling to set himself free from the shackles of those chains. Mischievously, Duck said there was nothing the stupid dog could do because it was tied on a leash. But right before him, this dog overruled every rule of metal physics and snapped the chain so it was only a centimeter away from Duck. Bro was terrified by what he just saw because he didn't expect the chains to break, so when Cerberus attempted to eat him, he just dodged together with the fox. Persephone was shocked to see these chains broken because she had never seen it happen, but Duck told her not to get too carried away and instead join him to run for her own life. He felt it was unfair that the dog was trying to eat him up because he played a harmless joke and that he sustained a slight graze on his arm. As they ran for their lives, Duck told Persephone to spread out, but she said he should stick to her side instead because even though she looked like a harmless virgin cheerleader, she was getting piped by the ruler of the underworld, so the dog wouldn't attack Duck carelessly because she was there. But it seemed Cerberus didn't really rate her as much as she thought, so he growled loudly because he was hungry for Duck's meat. Duck went rogue this time around and called upon Snow White, who transformed into Hercules' club. He jumped high up in the air with the club, aiming to throw the stick in his mouth, but just as soon as he landed the perfect strike, the dog pushed him to the ground with its paw, and Duck was terribly wounded. Now, Cerberus was ready to feast on Duck, and Persephone had to warn him to stay far away from the river Styx because if he fell in, he'd be consumed immediately. However, Duck's mind was blurred and he couldn't really hear what she was saying, so Persephone was confused about what to do. She then commanded Cerberus to stop and sit, but the obstinate dog refused to listen and charged straight for Duck's head. He had already given up at this point, but just before completely giving up, Duck refused to die by getting eaten alive, so instead, he fell back into the water, where the ominous hands were waiting to grasp him. The moment he disappeared, Persephone was horrified and called out his name in helpless shock. Meanwhile, Duck could feel his body sinking deeper into cold water and couldn't even help himself out of his situation, so he felt like he was dying. Memories of his life started flashing before his very eyes, including the part-time jobs he struggled to get. The good parts of his life felt like an illusion, but Duck remembered that there was lots of stuff he really wanted to get from the God Store, but was unable to do so. Gradually, these memories drifted along with his body, and he realized that he was on the brink of death. But before his eyes shut completely, he saw Snow White approaching him, even though he wished the fix wouldn't die because of him. Snow White luckily grabbed the doofus before he drowned to death, but since he couldn't lift him, the fox grabbed him by the nose and started pulling him up to the surface, even though he was bleeding to death. But the other problem arising was the death hands that arose from within and pulled him deeper into the water, with some choking the leftover air out of his lungs, while his consciousness slowly drifted away. He saw images of Red Fist, and it inspired him to get the dwarf hammer with which he fought away all those hands dragging him to his death. And then with one powerful push, he sunk them all to the bottom of the sea. He soon remembered that he wasn't breathing one bit, so he quickly tried swimming to the surface, and after a long stretch of eternity of swimming, he finally made it to the surface and was glad to have defeated death. However, he soon returned to the rabid dog and found its mouth wide open. So before he could do anything, Cerberus shut its teeth with about half of Duck's body shut in with him. Typically Duck was supposed to be dead, but he found himself trapped in the mouth of the monster. He was shocked to see that he was still alive, and suddenly the status popped up and said the effect of the Styx River would soon be initiated. It gradually started taking effect and granted him immunity from poison, stuns, and bleedings, making him immune to all forms of physical attacks. Duck still didn't understand what was going on, but the myth was that whoever soaked himself in the Styx River would become an invincible warrior. It happened when goddess Thetis soaked her son in the river, and he became the strongest warrior, but he had a weakness on his heels because they didn't get soaked in the water. So the boy Achilles died from a wound to his heels. However, since Duck was completely soaked in the river, he was sure to have no weakness, so even when the angry beast tried tearing him apart, nothing really happened to Duck. Cerberus started finding it weird that his meal wasn't dying even as Persephone tried to drag him out. Eventually, the dog gave up on Duck and spat him out, but Persephone called him filthy. She was, however, surprised that nothing happened to Duck even after he entered the river, so he said he just flailed his hammer in the water and the evil hands left him. Meanwhile, the dog was being upset with Duck, so he raged on and bit on Duck's hand, but he wasn't even feeling itchy. And that was when it became clear to Persephone that a low-class god wouldn't have survived the dogs except one who had gotten the blessing of immortality, just like Duck. Now it was time for him to walk the dogs since they refused to eat. Even after that, the dogs kept growling at him, and Duck told him it was pretty useless for them to keep doing that because then he wouldn't take them out for a walk. It seemed this got through their thick skulls, and after a moment of silence, they just turned their backs to him. God wasn't giving typical dog vibes, but when they turned back, they looked so absolutely adorable. Duck took the dog chains in his hands, but Persephone told him that the dog hadn't been out for a walk, so he could take it as slowly as possible. He felt like this wasn't a problem for him because Duck absolutely had no talent outside being a stupid dog walker. But to his greatest surprise, Cerberus took off without him, and took him on the wildest ride of his life, bumping his head against every stone and every turn. Instantly, he acquired the wind speed skill because he had fulfilled the condition of running for 3 minutes at the speed of 100 kilometers per hour. He was trying to figure this out when Persephone stepped in graciously with her magic to save the situation, and told him to use his divine power to strengthen his body. But that wasn't even the problem for Duck, because he was seeing this lady running faster than a Formula 1 driver could drive. Anyway, she told him to strengthen himself again because Cerberus was too powerful. He realized that she was talking about his actual divine power in numbers, so he asked how the heck he could do that. This was so shocking to Persephone that she stopped midway in her graceful race, wondering how a dunce like Duck could have lived on Earth for so long. She yelled at him, and he confirmed that indeed, he didn't know how to use his divine power. But at this point, Duck's face was about to get a free facial reconstructive surgery performed by oxygen itself. So Persephone resumed running and told him to remember the feeling of using his power. Duck said he was too dumb to comprehend basic instructions, so she had to speak to him in Goo Goo Gaga. He tried doing what she said, and got himself to feel what it was like to use his divine power. He remembered that it's activated during his battle with Charon the boatman, specifically, when the instinct power kicked in. So Persephone told him to remember it as an image, and think of it as controlling water inside his body. Duck closed his eyes and imagined controlling the water, while his power gradually came over him and concentrated on his hands, granting him his strength to hold down the chain and stop the dog right that moment. This was so shocking that Duck couldn't believe he really stopped Cerberus, so Persephone congratulated him and told him to keep it up, focusing the divine power on the part of his body he wanted to strengthen. He kept going, and Cerberus was obviously vexed, so he kept trying to pull it. But Duck maintained control and tried anchoring his feet to the ground. Soon he was almost losing it, and tried to think of the best body part to focus his divine power on. So he placed it in his hands, and for some reason he got way overpowered that he sent him flying to the moon. At this point, Duck was tired and decided to head back, but Cerberus was still resisting, so he said that was an indication for him to do things his own way. Before the stupid dog heads knew it, they were hanging in the air like balloons, and Persephone was so shocked, because it was Duck's very first time using his power, yet he was handling it like a pro, and for some reason she wouldn't mind him manhandling her like that. So she told him she was glad she got a good part-time job because it meant she could get a four-way with him and the dogs. It was then Duck realized how weird the whole situation was because it was obvious that Persephone was also overpowered. So he wondered why she didn't interfere in everything. He asked her why she wasn't coming near Cerberus, because he was pretty sure she could easily suppress the dog. But she looked so long for a moment and confessed that there were restrictions. Duck pried more to know the restrictions and learned that Cerberus was guarding the gates of hell, blocking countless numbers of lost spirits who were trying to go back to the mortal world, and also preventing those who tried to get into it out of curiosity. Surprisingly, Persephone confessed that she was one of those who wanted to go back. The rest of the walk was silent and sober, and the summary of the matter was that Persephone was restricted in the underworld and couldn't do anything about Cerberus. The only thing she could keep herself entertained with was the fact that Hades permitted a few beings such as Duck into the underworld. Just like in the myths, Hades had kidnapped and imprisoned Persephone after being mesmerized by her beauty, so unbelievable that Duck never believed it until now. It was quite saddening as he realized that Persephone had spent an unimaginable amount of time in the underworld all by herself. But Duck suddenly realized that he was having some weird sense of justice that he had to get rid of. As a matter of fact, Persephone's husband was Hades, who was the brother of the greatest god Zeus, so there was possibly nothing that Duck could do. Just then, Snow White started his attention-seeking antics on Duck, who apologized for leaving him behind, and eventually they dropped Cerberus at the gates of hell where he belonged. However, something felt wrong with Cerberus and Duck wondered what was suddenly wrong with the dog out of the blue. But Persephone told him that he was chasing after the dead, and despite how things looked, he was pretty good at his job, which was why she hadn't left so far. Anyway, she told Duck that after he chained Cerberus back to the pillar, he'd be done with his morning duties. Duck wasn't finding it funny that a dog was monitoring a goddess because that showed how uptight Hades was. In the first place, Duck couldn't understand why Hades was raising a dog only he could handle. But suddenly, Duck's talent of intuition activated itself, and he saw that there was some sort of gem in the pillar. He instantly became curious, and with his power focused on his hand, he felt confident enough to go check it out. Persephone said they had completed the morning duties, so it was time to prepare for the afternoon duties, but when she suddenly saw Duck poking his finger in a rock repeatedly, all she wanted to be was a rock at that moment. Anyway, he pulled out a dog collar, and she asked him what on earth he was doing, so he came back to his senses and explained that he felt something was inside the pillar. As he held it out, the status window popped up and stated that Cerberus's collar was used by Hades to train the dog, so anyone who used it would make Cerberus follow his commands. Persephone was dismayed and couldn't believe that her husband had hidden it in that location all this time because she had been looking for it and never found it. She asked how Duck found it, so he said he was mostly just a hunch. He wanted to know if the color was actually as good as the window claimed it was, and the lady affirmed that it certainly was because Cerberus was a symbol of the underworld, meaning that commanding the dog one was commanding the underworld as well. The collar still felt like crap to Duck, and he even said that he couldn't use it because it was Hades' property after all. It seemed like Persephone was deep in thought, and she said it wasn't forbidden for him to use it because her husband would occasionally tell her to try and look for the collar. He also said that he would let her train Cerberus if she actually ever found it. Duck wasn't interested in all these family matters, but he couldn't let go of the chance for his part-time job to be a piece of cake for him. He called the dog to place on its neck, but Cerberus resisted, and Duck had to remind it that he was boss there. Eventually, he placed the collar on the dog's neck. After a bit of violence here and there, the dog cried like a baby. It became docile, and Duck said it would be nice if the dog had behaved right from the start. The next few minutes were absolute torture for Cerberus, and Duck was just using this guy to enjoy his life. He was glad that the collar walked because it showed that even this rabid dog had an element of cuteness in him, but you don't. Anyway, he made him face the wall as punishment for biting and dragging him, and Duck was excited that his job would actually be a piece of cake. He was distracted for a second and felt a hand on his shoulder, so he turned to talk with Persephone. However, she chanted some incantations and placed him in a spell, confusing him at that moment and making him fall to the ground. She then stated that her husband had two final orders for Cerberus. The first was to monitor the dead who tried to escape the underworld, and the second was the monitor herself. Duck felt drowsy at this point, so before he fell asleep, Persephone told him to sleep tight as she gradually disappeared and said she would return before her husband did. Shortly before his eyes closed, Duck realized that the most important treasure to Hades wasn't the underworld, but his beloved Persephone. And unfortunately, right now, Duck couldn't move even if he wanted to stop her. Moments later, Snow White bothered Duck with his cute noises, and the poor guy woke up in a confused and shocked state, wondering how on earth he fell asleep. Immediately, he became concerned about Persephone. So when he looked around to find that she was nowhere, he knew he effed up for real. He wondered for how long he had been asleep at the window and found out that he hadn't been asleep for so long. He immediately got ready to leave and told Cerberus to guard the gates while he headed out. Normally Persephone won't be able to leave the underworld because of Cerberus, so if word got out that she escaped because of Duck, he was pretty sure that Hades would beat him until he bled out. He wondered how far she had gone because he needed to find her immediately, so he remembered that he recently acquired this Wind Rush skill. So he activated its status window, said that the skill will be enhanced based on his own physical abilities. In no time, Duck was dashing off at the speed of light, and that was fast even for him, so the next time around he tried to activate while using his divine power. Of course, this multiplied the speed so much so that he was basically teleporting, and then while he was mid-air, he found Persephone sailing peacefully on a boat. She was enjoying a peaceful sailing experience, but it was suddenly alerted by sound, which made her think she hit a rock. Before she knew it was happening, Duck up from under the water and asked her where the heck she thought she was going. Reminded her that she warned him that no one could cross the Styx River alone, and so he called her out for capping without restriction. However, Persephone apologized, saying she just wanted to see her mother, and this instantly calmed Duck down. He said she should still have planned ahead, but she told him not to worry because there were still 2 days until the husband would get back. And as a matter of fact, she had never been caught before. It was at this moment Duck realized that this wasn't her first time, but right then he noticed that the boat had cracked and wouldn't be able to hold on to the back. With only 15 seconds left of the Styx effect, Duck had no better choice, so he drew in some breath and dived right into the river. He inhaled and held onto the boat, after which he told Persephone to hold on tight, while he gave her the wettest ride of her life. Eventually they arrived at shore and came out to some form of paradise. He asked her to promise him something, which was that they would go back right away immediately after she visited her mother. But she reminded him that there was no point in getting worried, because just like she said, she had never been caught. He told her he was definitely going to die if she ever got caught, so she said if he was really that worried, he could just tag along. She led the way to a cave, and Duck was just concerned for those Greek gods, because he wondered why they chose to live in a cave of all places. Soon, Persephone met her mom named Demeter, who was the goddess of agriculture. The old surprised lady asked what was going on, so Persephone said she was her daughter after all. This made the woman so happy to reunite with her daughter, and both ladies were happy. Duck was watching them and just wishing he could be squeezed in between their silicone milk bags. He was attracted to something on the ground, which was a blooming flower. According to Greek mythology, while Persephone was in the underworld, all the plants withered as a result of Demeter's sadness, which was equivalent to winter in real life. He decided to give them some space and created some dumb excuse, but Persephone was surprised that he wasn't going to monitor her anymore. He told her he'd meet her at the river at a certain time, so she called him, and with a smile on her face thanked him. Later the boat was fixed and ready to be on the river, but it was 3 minutes past the time and Persephone should have been there by that time. While he was playing with the blooming flowers, another hand came from behind him, and he thought that was Persephone, who had returned. However, it turned out to be Hades, who called him an insolent punk. His intuition immediately activated and told him he was in grave danger and would actually die. Right now, this handsome, gobsmacking god of death only wanted to know where exactly his wife was. Even though this man hasn't even moved an inch towards Duck, he already felt his body rattling like an autumn leaf, and since he didn't know who this was, he wondered if it was Hades. Asked him if he was an idiot, and said he couldn't believe that some fool like himself could find Cerberus' collar and help Persephone escape. Right now, none of that matters at all, so Hades just wanted Duck dead on the spot just before he sent the scaredy cat to the underworld. Persephone showed up and asked why he was trying to kill an innocent god. This was a really good distraction, so he asked her where she had been. She reminded him that he was the one who kept telling part-time to look for Cerberus' collar, so she didn't understand why he was getting upset right now, even as they had found it. Hades wasn't just happy that she ran off without saying anything because that was too much for his dead heart to handle, but she said she wasn't running off and only went out for a bit because, as he could see, she returned right after visiting his mom. Like a sad little puppy. He insisted, said that she should still have said something, but Persephone said she wasn't a kid that would have to tell him everything. It was pretty weird, because Hades was getting flustered, saying he was pretty worried and acting like a hopeless romantic. Anyway, Persephone had way too much to say, but said they'd continue in the underworld. She brought out a box from some portal and handed it over to Duck. asking him to consider it a bonus. However, Hades wondered why Persephone was letting him live, and she says Duck did his part-time job accurately and satisfied her all night when Hades went off to be with his side chicks. She told Duck that she'll take care of his payment, and he shouldn't bother with returning there. Immediately, Duck was teleported back to Earth, and he was only glad to have survived yet another part-time job that almost claimed his life like the others. Anyway, he had his gift box, so he was curious about it and opened it. As he did, the box started glowing, and he found out that Persephone gave him her forbidden fruit. This would allow him to distinguish between good and evil. There were 2 forbidden fruits, and me was the golden apple, which greatly surprised Duck, seeing that his mum now stood a chance of recovery. However, he wasn't so sure that his mum, being a human, would be able to consume food that was meant for the gods. He held apple in his hand and picked the purple one by the stalk. That was the forbidden fruit, and he was pretty skeptical about whether he could eat it or not. Let's just say that everything worked out for Duck because at the hospital, the doctor declared his mom cancer-free. He couldn't believe what in science or black voodoo. This was because he couldn't explain how she suddenly got healed. The woman broke down crying, but her son reminded her that they had only happy times up ahead. It seems the golden apple worked, and Duck administered it by serving her his juice. Now that she was declared healthy enough to be discharged, he told her they could return to his place. Duck stopped a cab for himself and his mom, and then told the driver his address. However, the man said they would have to drive around to get there, but Duck was curious about why he wasn't taking the shorter route. It seems there was some news of a disaster near the area, so the driver turned on the FM radio for more insight. Apparently, a cylinder-like dungeon had appeared and citizens were continuing their evacuation. While this was being investigated by hunters and guilds, it led to traffic congestion. Seeing this, his mom told him to go off by himself because she could tell him at the dungeon, and she was excited to see him on TV. A brief warning that she gave was that she'd be watching him, so he shouldn't overdo anything. Later, Duck arrived at the dungeon, which looked pretty challenging even from the outside. This was yet another reason for Duck to lose some hours of sleep, but he was down for it anytime as long as he had snow with him. Before going in, he decided to check out the stores and found that he had 12 Thor, meaning he was yet to get paid by Hades and Persephone. The system gradually updated his profile and he got a new title, named The One Who Tamed Cerberus. Duck was surprised because this was really unexpected, but he even found out that he was now the new president of dogs. Imagining this, though, gave a not-so-cute picture of things because he felt like a cheap, worthless dog walker. He was distracted right then by voices around who pointed to him as someone important. But it seems everyone was actually talking about Soil, and reporters were bombarding her with questions, especially pretending the fact that she wasn't even trying to clear the dungeon personally. Duck felt embarrassed while Soil gave a really short answer and respectfully told them to EFF off. Watching her ignore them all so easily, Duck was really feeling her, but he couldn't stand here watching like a jobless simp because he had more important things to do. Soil and her guild members were wondering whether the monsters were planning a surprise attack and prepared for that because they felt the attack couldn't be anything that serious if the beasts were just some oversized dogs. 2 guild members began teasing each other, but this led to a petty fight and Soil had to bring them back to order. One of the guild members noticed that she was acting strangely because she typically barely ever said a word, and hardly ever got upset at cheap mischief like that. He felt she must have been seeing something that was making her behave the way she did, but the issue was what exactly was she seeing? They turned on their lights and Soil calmly told them that the monsters were coming. Just as she said, a giant mutant dog showed up and wanted to eat out her candy until she screamed so hard. The guys were shocked to see the beasts because no one informed them that they'd be meeting such deadly hounds. These species of dogs had a venom so deadly that even a scratch from their fangs would take a person's life in 10 minutes. On the plus side, they had really long, flexible tongues dripping with hot, slimy cream sauce for lubrication. Seeing that they were quite the monsters, Soil announced that whoever was a weak idiot should step back while the rest would fight with her. One of them started humming some stupid nursery rhyme, so the deputy commander snapped. However, they said the sound didn't come from their own end, and when they looked for the source, they found a shadow figure behind the hounds. This was deeply surprising because they couldn't believe that anyone at all could have tamed those mad dogs. They felt this could only be the work of the humanoid monster or a demonic human. The deputy stepped forward to protect Soil, telling her to stand back, while he yelled for the figure to show himself. The loud goat kept asking if the figure was a demonic monster or whatnot, but Duck told him to lower his weapon. Duck could tell that this dude was simply blasting his pants, while the deputy revised that he'd been confronting a human all the while. Unknowingly, one of the hounds was behind Soil and almost attacked her. But Duck was quick to detect this, so he activated his windrush skill and rushed straight for Soil. Before the deputy could protect the lady, Duck had already grabbed her arm and made a fist, almost like he was about to punch her. It turns out that he was only trying to punch one of the stupid hounds he'd tamed, and his taming abilities arose as a result of his new title as the one who tamed Cerberus. Meanwhile, the deputy was rather surprised that Duck wasn't trying to attack Soil as he'd wrongly assumed. Duck found something weird about the bracelet on her hands, so he said hi to her with a naughty smirk on his face. Duck realized that the bracelet there was the same as Persephone's, so he started by asking her why she was wearing the bracelet. However, she told him not to even start up anything because there were so many eyes watching them. He was initially confused when he realized that he was posed as if he was proposing to her, with one knee on the floor and him holding her hands so intimately. By then, it was too late and Soil's guild members had already become overnight paparazzis and were taking pictures of their dungeon proposal. Anyway, Duck's attention was back to the hounds, so he commanded them to sit, and they immediately obeyed. He then ordered them to dig a certain area, and then did some weird salute that no one was able to understand. Immediately, the dogs got to work and soon unearthed some red crystals from the ground, so they started bringing them over to Duck. The guild boys couldn't believe their eyes again, and their deputy commander felt like all this was a dream. Soil herself had to compliment Dyke's ability and said it was really amazing, so she asked where he got it from. This took Duck off guard because it was expected that everyone got their abilities naturally from birth, so he wondered how on earth Soil knew that he gained this ability. Anyway, he said he didn't gain it but was born with it, and he returned the gesture by asking her a question, which was whether the bracelet on her hands belonged to her. She claimed it was hers and sarcastically added that there was no other reason why she'd be wearing it if it wasn't. He then asked where have bought it from, but she remained silent, and Duck repeated the question. There was no response, so Duck concluded in his mind that the bracelet with its old-fashioned design was the exact friendship bracelet Persephone had told him about. The question on his mind right now was why exactly Soil had it. This lady had initially seemed to Duck as a vicious stalker, but now he had other questions on his mind, like who or what type of being she was. After remaining silent for minutes, Soil said she got the bracelet off the interment, so Duck used his forbidden fruit on her and discovered that she was telling the truth. It analyzed her and surprisingly said her intentions were nearly good, while Soil went on to add that if Duck wanted the bracelet, she'd send him the link to purchase it. He felt really ashamed of himself for thinking she was lying, so he tried to make the situation less awkward by saying he was really in love with the bracelet. As they watched him, the guys were absolutely disgusted as they imagined him fawning over a bracelet and violating his masculinity just like that. They even started whispering among themselves that Duck had a thing for girly bracelets, and that was probably the reason why he ran up to Soil like that. Their words were stabbing Duck's precious heart without them knowing, and he felt he was only being so sensitive because of his recent interdimensional travels. Unfortunately, he overdid his pretend love for the bracelet, and now his street cred among the guys would hit rock bottom. He decided to cover this up with something else and had the intention of bringing Soil down with him this time around. He asked her how she knew Snow White's name that day, and whiner it was because she'd been stalking his Instagram like every creepy ex. However, Soil said she only knew this because she heard others say it, and that at the gate, she heard someone call Snow's name. Again, this was the truth, and Duck was put to shame for the second time that day, and would bury himself alive at that moment. He realized that he'd been the one jumping to insane conclusions and had been misunderstanding her all this time. However, the dungeon suddenly trembled, and some giant devil demon stepped forth and announced that all the weaklings in his dungeon were about to kiss death's black behind. He was laughing maniacally when a fist punched him right in the face, talking him unaware. That was Duck telling him to shut up because everyone was tired of his noise, and he beat him up with every last ounce of his strength. The boys watching this were in total shock and disbelief of the fact that Duck was humbling a boss that easily, and had even turned him into mashed potatoes already. Duck was panting so hard and looking like a psychopath, so he walked up to the leader and asked him to hide the fact that he ever showed up to the dungeon, and to keep everything he said in there a secret. He personally went around telling the guild members to keep his secret. While Soil was mysteriously looking at the bracelet she claimed to have ordered off the internet. Later, Soil and her guild members stepped out of the guild while Duck stepped out disguising in a cap and jacket. Reporters started interviewing Soil and asking how her experience with clearing the dungeon was, and she said as their leader she was glad that there was no injury sustained while they carried out the raid. Duck was deep in thought and realized that in order to work as a hunter in their country, one had to undergo an official test to qualify. This was because hunters possessed great powers, and so they had to be managed by guilds. And for that reason, the hunter's information could be easily accessed on the hunter website. Obviously, Duck didn't even qualify as a hunter, and he'd been trespassing all the dungeons and gates he'd successfully cleared. This made internet folks question the authenticity of his claims and even felt he was just being a delulu. He realized that if this went on, his divine power would eventually begin to decrease, so he had to leave that spot quickly and let Soil take care of things herself. On his way, he accidentally brushed past someone, but the dude quickly recognized him and Duck stopped dead in his tracks. The next thing was that the guy started laughing and mocking Duck, asking what a talentless insect like him was crawling around for. Others heard him mention Duck's name and were confused, wondering why that guy referred to Duck as talentless when the news portrayed him to be an insanely talented guy. Duck didn't seem pleased to see this guy who was calling him, even as the guy acted familiar with him, asking why he wasn't vibing. His name was Young, and was a guy who made Duck's life miserable at school. He was popularly referred to as a ruffian from a rich family, and who made Duck feel like the world wasn't ruled by gods, but by the wealthy elites. However, things were different now, so Duck pulled the guy's hand away and told him he still hadn't changed from running his stinky mouth simply because he was from a rich family. Young asked him to repeat what he said, and held his hand to punch Duck, while telling him that his fame shouldn't be getting into his head just yet. He added that based on the news, he heard that Duck cleared a labyrinth dungeon and destroyed a gate. But it all felt weird because Duck was a talentless son of a gun, and the kid was so unbelievably despicable. All of these feats were way too impossible for Young to believe because all his life, he'd known Duck to be a talentless insect. The crowd heard this and began to suspect that Duck was indeed a liar, because he wasn't even on the Hunter website. Overhearing their gossip, Duck smelled trouble, but just then, Soil walked up to them, grabbed Duck's cap from Young and gave it back to him. The guy asked Soil what his deal was and why she seemed to be protecting a worthless insect like Duck. But she retorted that being talentless didn't mean a person was trash, and then she asked him if he could be responsible for his word. However, Young felt this was all bull because he knew Duck to the core, and he'd always been an idiot without any form of talent. She then shot Duck a knowing look, but the guy was confused and didn't know what to do. And after trying to understand what she was hinting at, he realized that Soil might have been urging him to prove himself. That wasn't a difficult task for him at all, so Duck simply jumped to the top of a story building and shocked Young, who chose to keep deluding himself that Duck was a scam. When Duck saw that the fool was a waste of his time, he turned his back and decided to leave this bitter Karen with a sausage behind. It was after this incident with Young that Duck realized how important it was for him to get the qualifications for being a hunter. He got up early and prepared to take a test. He was initially planning on going by himself, but Soil showed up and decided to take him there. Thereafter, they arrived, and he thanked her for riding him all the way to heaven, after which he got to the test grounds and found that Soil followed him all the way. She said it was because she had no plans for the day, but Duck wondered why a future guild leader would be living like a princess. He asked her why she was suddenly sounding informal to him, and she said they were age mates after all, and might as well be friends with 1,000 benefits. The system notified him that she was telling the truth and had pure intentions, so he agreed. Soon, it was his turn to take the exam, so he left Snow in her care. Duck knew exactly why Soil came, but as long as she was only feeding Snow and had clean intentions, there wouldn't be much of a problem. They soon told him it was time for the test, and that he could only use the gear provided. First, they measured his lower body strength and increased his weight load to max settings. Duck didn't understand how on earth this was a basic physical exam, but Young showed up and said he should have known his place. The system notified him that Young had evil intentions, and the guy kept yapping, saying Duck should better hurry up and lift the entire ton of weight on his neck, otherwise he'd be disqualified. Since Young was gonna play dirty, Duck decided to empower himself with his powers, and while Young yapped on, he lifted the weight and achieved 6 stars for his lower body strength, and another 6 for his upper body because he lifted it with one hand. He also achieved 6 stars for his core strength, and another 6 for speed, all which were unbelievable in Young's eyes. He angrily jacked up the innocent examiner and told him to stop Duck already. but the man said he couldn't stop the test unless there was some sort of error. Jung insisted that everything Duck was doing was an error. But by then, Duck's basic fitness strength was completed, and he got 5 to 6 stars in approximately everything. So he was permitted to proceed to the next hall. In the hall, the candidates were welcomed and congratulated by some guy, who said their next test would judge their teamwork spirit, which was an indispensable quality for one to become a hunter. They weren't allowed to use any equipment other than the ones provided, and if they killed monsters of other groups, it wouldn't affect their team score. Next, monsters were released, and some ugly mutant fish on steroids came out. One of them leaped towards a baldy with his knife, and then the monster used its kegs to hold him down at the neck. It then proceeded to lift its knife, prepared to end the weak dude once and for all, when Duck suddenly showed up from the blue and stepped in between them as he intercepted the monster's attack. He asked if the dude could get up so he'd defeat the monster from that angle, in just a matter of him thrusting his sword really deeply into the monster's wet meat. He was successful and the beast died on the spot. On the other end, some candidates were struggling to get rid of the beast who had now overpowered them. So Duck positioned himself and attacked about 3 monsters all by himself, making his team members really shocked and glad to have him because they might successfully pass the test all thanks to him. Suddenly, that dung-faced Jung appeared out of a portal, showed us his ugly teeth, and poured some elixir into the mouth of a mutant fish, which immediately expressed a strong murderous intent and leaped toward Duck. The system detected this for Duck, but even at that he narrowly escaped the surprise attack launched by the monster from the sides. This was shocking to the other team members who realized that one of the beasts was still alive, so it immediately turned its attention towards them, and before they could brace up for a defensive attack, it attacked all of them simultaneously. Duck could not believe what his eyes were seeing because of all the people in the team. He was the only one who survived the test. The crap face told Duck that there was no point in continuing because he couldn't score without his teammates anyway, and then he cockily reminded Duck that he warned him to play on his level. Duck was furious as he realized that everything became weird the moment Jung got involved, and he was surprised that Jung would go so far just to see him fail. He turned back to leave, but Jung asked him why he wasn't giving up already, because it'd be useless without Duck's teammates. Immediately, Duck shut him up and said he'd become a great hunter no matter what happened. In a split second, he sliced off the beast's tail and chopped its head off. But he didn't stop there. He also got rid of every single beast in the building in one flash. So even though he could no longer get team points, he could get individual points and had gotten 200 out of the 100 points required to win. Both Jung and the examiner were shocked to see this, so the man began to announce the results of the second test. But suddenly, an emergency announcement was made for everyone to exit the test room and seek shelter in the nearest location because a huge tsunami was headed in their direction. As water poured into the room, Duck became curious and wanted to know what was going on. So he pushed Jung off the platform and plunged himself upwards and out of the room. He eventually landed on the roof and saw a huge water wave that had already started destroying the walls of the building, and he knew that no one would survive that wave. Coincidentally, the status window informed him that his payment had arrived and Persephone sent an apology for taking so long to send it. He desperately searched the store to find something that could help the current situation, and luckily found a wave splitter, which was a form of sword art that was powerful enough to split a wave. Suddenly, Snow White appeared and Duck was confused, wondering why the fox showed up without soil. For now that wasn't so important, so he focused his attention on the task at hand and took up his sword. Thereafter, the SS-ranked wave splitter was activated and Duck used his sword to slash through the water, causing a large divide in the water wave. Seeing this, Duck was excited that he was able to calm the storm, and he so returned to the test center afterwards. The announcer said there'd likely be a second wave of the tsunami and urged that all the candidates should seek shelter and leave the test room. Now that was strange to Duck, who wondered why the tsunami would happen for a second time, because he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop it again. Just then, he got an urgent recruitment notice from Poseidon, who was seeking for an underwater palace repair team because the underwater palace barricade had gone damaged and resulted in tsunamis in the human world. Duck then realized that the tsunamis happening were from the world of the gods, but his thoughts were interrupted when the message showed that there were no applicants even though the situation was urgent. Now, based on the recruitment notice, Duck could tell that the tsunamis won't stop until repairs were done. And he just started recounting how many terrible experiences he had with the goods, showing just how troublesome they were. He quickly accepted the job and was teleported to the underwater palace of Poseidon. right behind him called out to him, and he found out that it was Hephaestus. The man was thrilled to have run into Duck again, and fondly patted his head. He noted that Snow White had gotten bigger, but when he tried to touch it, the fox rejected his advances and made him cry. Duck found this strange because Snow White was so affectionate with soil, but he turned his attention to Hephaestus and asked what he was doing there. Hephaestus said the repairs couldn't progress in the absence of a blacksmith, and he also thanked Duck for showing up on such short notice. He then proceeded to explain the situation at hand and showed Duck a crack in the wall which was squirting holy water off the gods on humans. Obviously gods would see it as a simple leak from a pool, but humans would experience it as a massive tsunami. Duck asked him how exactly the barricade got damaged in the first place, so Hephaestus showed him a gate through which the water was draining. He gods had tried tirelessly to get rid of it, but all to no avail. It was rather surprising to Duck, who initially thought that gates were being created by the gods, just like dungeons, so now he was more curious about them. Suddenly, Snow started misbehaving and Duck was trying to figure out what his problem was, when the animal drew his attention to the area around the gate, which had gradually started trying to drag Duck into the gate. Hephaestus warned him to hold on tight to something, because if he fell into the hole, that would be the end of him. Unfortunately, Snow had already been sucked into the gate, so Hephaestus went after him and jumped into the other side of the gate. As soon as he left, he punched through the ring with a giant hand and tried hard to pick it up. Before Duck knew it, Hephaestus had lifted up the gate with two of his hands, so he realized that the highest level gods were on an entirely different level. However, while it was suspended, some creepy monsters started flooding in and Duck was rather shocked that the gates in the realm of the gods also had waves of monsters coming in. From a portal, Hephaestus retrieved a sword and pushed it to Duck. Then he said he'd leave Duck to handle the monsters while he blocked the gate. Duck, on the other hand, felt cheated because he thought this was just a repair job. But here he was again working overtime for a raise he'll never get. He got right to slicing the monsters through, but immediately his intuition was triggered, and he found out that the monster was still trying to attack him. Duck dodged the attack, but was surprised that even though he struck the monster with divine power, he still somehow withstood the attack. Next, the monster called Duck a disgusting Olympus piece of crap and threatened to rip him to shreds, so Duck was shocked at the fact that it could even talk, and he wondered what the heck was wrong with that fool, because from his experience, monsters from the gates were weaker. Certainly this meant that Duck was in danger as he faced these strange guys. Before he knew it, some other guys with plastic surgery lips appeared from behind him and started running towards the other side. But it turns out that they weren't running towards him, but towards their own kind. They began to attack each other and Duck was left there standing confused as he wondered why they were fighting each other. It seemed the second group was Poseidon's reinforcement group, so at least Duck won't have to face the intruders all by himself. But while he was still deep in his thoughts, one of the monsters tried to attack him from behind, but he struck back with his sword. Thereafter, he slashed 3 more times, but there was no effect on the monster, just like the first time he attempted. Even with Duck's divine power, he could barely manage to scratch the monster, showing how sturdy the species of monsters were. Soon, the monster said he was tired and bored of playing with Duck, and told him to stop resisting so he'd die already. At the same time, he was preparing to land a huge attack on Duck, so the boy prepared himself and instantly activated the Wave Splitter skill. This instantly sent a huge slash that cut across numbers of the monsters at once, so their body parts were all seared away from them. Thereafter, it was time for him to face the next batch, so they rushed to attack him again and Duck was really confident that his skill would show up again for him. However, the system noticed that he didn't have enough skill points, so he knew he'd certainly effed up. He started nagging because down to this point, everything had been working just fine. Just as the fish was going to end him once and for all, Duck immediately surrendered. But suddenly the monster was shot and more bullets were fired at a time, all coming from a single underwater pistol. Surprisingly, the attacker was Red Fist, together with the other dwarves who came to back Duck up, and who apologized for arriving a little late. In no time, the monster alerted the others that the dwarves were present, and Red Fist and his 2 goons took a moment to let their riz sink in. This irritated the leader of the monsters who threatened to rip them all to shreds, but the blonde with a pot belly dared him to come at him because he was ready to send a bullet into his brain. However, he found out that the fish monster was holding a rock, but he was too late, and the guy had already thrown the rock at him, which he countered with his gun. Since he was already disoriented, the fish monster took that opportunity to attack him from above, and then he kicked him into oblivion. Soon the other dwarves saw their guy falling and Red Fist was pissed as heck, so he took out his mighty hammer and smashed the monster into the ground. This took Duck down memory lane and he recalled using the dwarf hammer unintentionally, which means that was probably a skill. He then called out for the skill and found that it only required 5 skill points, so he could easily get it. On the other side, one of the monsters was attacking the other dwarf and ready to behead him with his bare hands. But right then someone called out to it from behind, and it was Duck with his sword in his hand, who had already activated the dwarf's hammer skill. Quite embarrassingly, the system cancelled the skill because it could only be used with blunt weapons, so Duck's attack only scratched the surface of the monster's head. He immediately knew he was in deep trouble, and the guy grabbed him and sent him flying a mile away. Duck sat down, regretting his life choices and wondering if the skill didn't work because he didn't have a blunt weapon, so this made him start missing snow already. But on second thought, he realized that his hands folded into a fist looked like a blonde weapon, so it meant he could use his fist as a dwarf hammer, knowing that his combat skill was ranked SS. Just then he saw that the dwarf was getting beaten black and blue, so he realized he didn't have time to hesitate and decided to trust his combat skill. He walked, pointing his fist towards the monster, but the monster grabbed his arm before he could do anything. However, Duck stuck to the plan and activated his dwarf hammer, so he punched the monster into the ground and ended it on the spot. When this was activated, his dwarf hammer on B level was evolved to dwarf hammer punch on A level. At that moment, no one appeared from the blue, and Duck was glad to have his baby back, so he turned snow into fist guards with which he began to throw dwarf hammer punches of those monsters on all fronts. After one of them spotted his fallen comrade, he knew he was next to die, but he could not save himself, and Duck punched him out of the world. At that point, Duck was done with almost everyone, but suddenly there was a sudden power surge at the gates, so Hephaestus told everyone to brace for impact. Duck was confused about what was going on, and the god said he couldn't handle the gate anymore, so they both watched it spiral out of control and suck in some of the monsters. At the time, Duck knew that all of them would get sucked in, and even more surprisingly, Hephaestus was part of those that were taken. The system then warned that an extremely powerful aura had been detected, and out of it was an unclear shadow who took form in the chaos. It soon became clearer, and a huge god-like figure holding a pitchfork stemmed out of the darkness. He seemed to have the same limbs as the fish monsters, and he walked with a mysterious, terrifying aura towards Duck, whom he confronted for messing up his subordinates. If this scary figure turns out to be Poseidon, the god of the sea, is Duck about to die the millionth time? Also, will Duck ever discover Soil's identity? If you'd like to find out in part 2, send Duck's Mighty Hammer in the comment section. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.